Good morning. So we're about to start. So if everyone can find their seats. And good morning to those joining us online. Welcome to our third annual hybrid erosion and sediment control workshop for North Carolina. So my name is Rebecca Copa. Many of you may know me already because I've been doing this for a couple of years now. And I am the sediment education specialist with the Department of Environmental Quality. I'd like to thank our organizing partners, the NCSU's Department of Crop and Soil Sciences, and the Southeast chapter of International Erosion Control Association, or IECA, as many of us know it. Without them, this workshop would not have been possible. To help facilitate everyone's participation today, myself and several of my DEQ colleagues will be moderating the virtual session. So if anyone has questions who is attending virtually, please put your questions in the chat or Q&A as appropriate, and we will moderate those to the speakers at the end of each presentation. For those in person, please keep your questions concise because we do ask that speakers repeat the questions into the microphone for the sake of our virtual attendees. The evaluation today is completely online. That includes the PDH evaluation and the generic end of workshop evaluation. You are able to submit two if you want the generic workshop evaluation to be anonymous. And for those attending in person, please remember to sign for your PDHs at the registration desk during one of the breaks before we head out to the field. Certificates will be handed out in the field for those attending in person, and for those who are attending virtually, certificates will be emailed to you within 2 weeks. If there are any questions, I will be available throughout the room all day, and I'll be introducing most of our speakers. But without further ado, our first speaker of the day is my boss, the state sediment specialist. I'm not going to repeat my own title, Julie Coco. Yes.
All right. Welcome, everyone. My name is Julie Coco. As Rebecca said, I'm the state sedimentation engineer for DEQ's Division of Energy, Mineral, and Land Resources. Welcome, everyone. We've got a pretty good crowd here today. We also have some folks online. So for those of you who are joining us online, welcome as well. As she said, we'll have a morning session. We've got plenty of topics to cover this morning, plenty of updates for you. We'll have lunch, I believe, in the next room here adjacent to us. And then in the afternoon, we'll head out for those of you who are in person, we'll head out to the field for some erosion control measures. Feel free to get you something to eat back there if you haven't already. We've got plenty of good food and breakfast items back there. Hot coffee. If the coffee is not hot enough for you, then the topics today certainly will. We've got quite a few important updates to get for you. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and get started. Yeah, it blocks out. Okay, here we go. Thanks. All right, so we're going to give you some updates this morning, as I mentioned. I'm going to stick with 3 topics today because I have a lot to cover and I expect that there will be some questions. We'll give you some updates on our erosion sediment control planning and design manual. That manual is the go-to source for our consultants when they submit plans to us for review for erosion control designs. And it is also the manual that is heavily used by our staff when reviewing plans that come through our offices. We haven't updated that manual since 2013, so we are in the process of doing that. And I'll give you a status kind of update of where we are for that. The second topic is the updates to the American Rescue Plan Act. In particular, one of the 9 provisions of that act is dealing with state and local fiscal recovery of funds. We do have some local government representatives here, so we'll cover some topics and updates to that as well. And then finally, we'll talk about Access DEQ. Has anybody heard about that or had anything to do with that so far, or no hands? That doesn't count. Okay, well, if not, then you're in for a treat. So we'll unveil that for you later today. So let's go ahead and get started. Okay. So this is the cover page for our erosion sediment control planning and design manual. We have a 12-member committee called the Commission Technical Committee, and they are a committee of the State Sedimentation Control Commission that is tasked with reviewing the changes to this manual. And they are a 12-member body made up of various stakeholders with different backgrounds and as far as different parts of the state as well. So we meet once a month and they deliberate and go over some of the practice standards. Right now, they're focused in Chapter 6. So with the practice standards that deal with the design criteria, construction and maintenance specifications, there are 52 practice standards in Chapter 6, and you can see just a handful of them over there to the left-hand side. And we have 8 chapters in all in our manual, so it's quite an undertaking. It's a pretty big book. But we have in the process solicited comments in the past from our regional staff who, again, use this manual every day. And the committee is dedicated to addressing those comments that they have in the manual. And what they do is they look over each of those practice standards. Sometimes they're pretty straightforward. Other times they involve quite a bit of deliberations. So the process is that once they review those criteria, they will then pass that on to Demler for the final cut and editing. And then we will be spruced up and present that before the commission for adoption. So where are we with that? Well, we've completed about 11 to date since we've started. Probably started a couple a few years ago. And, initially we were kind of getting our feet off the ground with it. Now we've kind of since gotten a little bit more efficient at how we're moving through the process. So when do we expect to be finished? Well, we don't have any hard deadline for that. We're trying to move at a pace that is fast enough to make sure that we're making progress, but slow enough to make sure that we're doing quality reviews and putting forth a good product in the end, what will be used by not only us, private consultants, but local governments as well rely upon it, as well as our DOT, which has a state delegated program. And so, we're very thankful for the people that are working on this. I want to thank all those committee members that are putting it together. Also want to thank our state education specialist there, Rebecca Copa. So she schedules the public meetings. They are held monthly and open to the public. And she takes the minutes. So very appreciative of that. All right, next topic is the American Rescue Plan Act, otherwise known as ARPA. In particular, we want to talk about the state and local fiscal recovery funding for that. If you're new to us and haven't been to our workshops before, the entire basis for our program is the implementation and enforcement of the State Sedimentation Pollution Control Act. So Yes, if you are a local government and you have received certain funds, don't forget that you have to have those funds obligated by December 31st of 2024 in your budget. And then you must have expended those by December 31st of 2026. So we're just a little over a year away from the obligation of those funds. And then 2 years subsequent to that, we will have, you will need to have expended those funds. So what are the funds used for? Well, they're not without strings attached. They come from the U.S. Treasury, and they are allocated for public health emergency response, such as vaccination programs, revenue loss, reimbursement for revenue loss for upgrades that would have been made during the pandemic had it not occurred, but were postponed for that reason. And it also includes things as modernization of cybersecurity systems for government entities. But what we're kind of focused on today is the publicly owned water and sewer infrastructure upgrades, and that does include a separate pot of money for stormwater upgrades, construction, maintenance, and retrofits that help protect for water quantity as well as water quality. So the funds are used to cover eligible costs that are incurred anywhere between March 3rd of 2021 and December 31st of 2024. So who are the orchestrators who are holding the purse strings, essentially? These are the entities, state entities that are, of course, the funds come from the Treasury, but some go directly to local governments and others are appropriated through passage of law in the General Assembly. North Carolina received $8.8 billion in their share of state and local funds combined. And the Division of Water Infrastructure is the one that if local governments typically apply through to get awarded that funding. If you were awarded, you should have received a letter of intent to fund from DWI. They, OSBMs, which is the Office of State Budget and Management, has a specific office, temporary office set up to deal with the distribution of these funds as well, and the accounting and everything that has to come along with these funds. So they're responsible for the distribution of $3.6 billion in coronavirus relief funds from the Treasury. And then our own Office of Continuous Improvement, the OCI, assists with resource allocation and information management. They'll put out surveys and assist with resources that are expected from the workload that's going to be coming from our office, coming to our offices. And then our own division at the bottom there is we are in the process of hiring dedicated ARPA-funded plan reviewers to assist with our anticipated workload. And we work with OCI to exchange information, track the projects, they will all have to be tracked, and maximize return on the investment of these funds. So one of the things that the OCI has done is put out a survey to all local governments, and we've had a pretty good response rate so far, about 95%. We still have a few more to go. We're aiming for 100%, but we are looking, they put out the survey to try to get an anticipation of the number of permits that must come through DEQ, because just because you're funded through DWI doesn't alleviate you from getting other permits within the agency. So we need to know how many permits by type, by count, and the distribution of those permits coming through our office. And as you can see, we have categorized by dark blue as the MPDS permits that we were expected to receive in response by the local governments. Non-discharge permits is red, and then yellow is the sewer utilities. Green is the 401 certifications we expect to give, or buffer authorizations, wetlands, that kind of thing. And then purple deals with water utilities. And light blue deals with stormwater, and then yellow is under my purview, and that is the erosion and sediment control. So you can see by far we are anticipating the maximum workload here for starting in Q4, which is where we are currently, and then in the first quarter of 2024. So the numbers out to the side represent the total number of permits through all color-coded projects that you see there. And in particular for erosion sediment control, we are looking in Q4 44 erosion control applications to come in statewide, 66 applications to come in statewide in the first quarter of 2024. So if you look across all of those 6 of those quarters, we're looking at just under 200 applications we're expected to receive in that time period. And we are trying to get those permitted before the end of 2024. So DWI, or Division of Water Infrastructure, does maintain a list of those projects that have been awarded. And you can see that here. The project number is essentially prefixed by 3 numbers that are one of their many funding programs that they have that identifies the project. And also, you know, it's an ARPA project by the fact that it has an ARP in the project number. And we have the project names, of course, but in the forefront of that, you will see what the questions that are asked on our applications. Let us know if you are a government that has intent to be funded. Let us know that you do have an ARPA project, and let us know what that project name is and that project number so that we can cross-reference over to DWI's listing. And we do have to track and be accountable for all the funds that we do receive. And I believe Stormwater asked for that same information as well. This is the survey. It's very quick and simple. This is it. So if you are a local government who has received one of those letters of intent to fund for your utilities projects or whatever that's covered under these funds, please complete this survey. We're almost at 100% response, but are encouraging everyone to fill it out, and that will help us allocate resources within the agency and will have a good chance of providing improved customer service with you as well as we go through the life of your project. Okay, and third, the final topic for today or this morning is access DEQ. So we have put out public service announcements about this. And what it is essentially we are moving, the entire department is moving towards an electronic permitting system. So we're trying to move away from our paper-based applications that will affect nearly everyone in this audience today, as well as those online. So it is a multi-year, multi-million-dollar effort between the Department of Environmental Quality and the Department of Information Technology. We launched to the public on November 1st of this year. So without further ado, I will introduce the Access DEQ Digital Hub. So this is the website that you see up at the top there. It is part of DEQ's permitting transformation program, if you've heard of that at all. Again, this is a multi-year effort. So we've been working on this for a few years now, and finally unveiling this to the public here recently. The PTP, as we'll call it, provides an overview and access to all programs who have gone online. The PTP team is a team of business analysts, developers, and project managers. And it currently encompasses 5 regulatory programs within the department. And our PTP program and data modernization efforts continue to drive innovation in our business practices. It's part of the effort to streamline our operations and improve transparency to the public. And as DEQ continues this effort, additional permit application and tools will become available online through this digital hub. So what are the components? What is it made up of? Well, it's pretty simple, but it has two major components. One, you have an online portal. So if you've dealt and submitted your applications before to local governments, those that have an erosion and sediment control program, and they've gone online, it's very similar to that. You will apply, instead of using a paper form, you will apply online to the website. And then on the back end is a database. That's where our staff works to process those applications. So it will handle intake, plan intake, the processing of applications, as well as your permits, tracking of those permits, reporting capabilities, our compliance efforts, and all communications are done through this system as well. Again, because it's fairly early, you notice of all the DEQ divisions that we have, there are only two that have gone live. First one was the coastal management, and then the sedimentation erosion control program within Demler is the second division and the second program for all of those to have gone live. So that's what you see there highlighted in yellow, and our programs in Demler. So others are in development currently, but they're not live. So you're probably not going to see those for potentially a few years. So we are trailblazing this effort. So what can it do for our program? Well, again, it'll handle application intake, plans. It'll, take plans. You upload your plans to through this portal. It include authorizations, so that financial responsibility and the ownership form, right, that you have to get notarized. That's an authorized statement of financial responsibility and ownership. And so it'll handle that, as well as intaking fees. The portal will accept applications for all regional offices, so you don't have to go to the specific regional office. This portal will handle everything through that one link. It will address and handle plan reviews, and it will handle standard reviews, as well as you can make a request for express reviews to be conducted to this portal as well. And it'll handle complaints through this system. You can make your complaints, log in and fill out the form to make a complaint, or you can do it anonymously outside of the portal login. All right, so before we jump into the portal, eventually we'll give you a sneak peek of what that's like. But right now, we had to kind of take a step back, because we are not the only program, and we realized, okay, this is going to be a department-wide effort. So we have the department level, and then we have the division level, and then we have programs or branches or sections, within the agency, and we all kind of speak a different language. So we had to take a step back and figure out what are some common language that we're going to have to use that our customers can be familiar with and can relate to, because now your integration with all the other permits within the agency is going to be through this login. So just to kind of get you acquainted, the term, what we use to and refer to as the plan approval, is now the permit. It's no big deal, right? You've heard of other permits throughout the system. We've used those terms interchangeably in the past. New location request. Well, what is that? Well, it is a department-wide term that refers to any facility, site, outfall, underground storage tank, anything else that is a permitted entity, anything that's regulated by DEQ, that refers to a specific location, and that will need a permit, a certificate, a plan approval, authorization, etc. Okay. The responsible official is an individual who has authority to act on behalf of that project site. So that would typically be the owner of the project, the manager, the company, the president of a builder or developer for us. It just means the financially responsible party. And then the preparer, that's the individual with access to that location, and that will be granted within the system. And they're the ones that will prepare the application on behalf of that project site. For us, in our sedimentation program, it just means, most of the time, it means the consultant. It can mean the landowner. So this is the paper application that that this portal will replace. If you've done business with us before, you know what that looks like. It has been plagued with problems filling out paper forms. Either they're not filled out completely, or they're not filled out correctly, or sometimes they're just not legible. So the portal aims to take away all of those problems that we had with the paper form. So how do you jump in? How do you get started with this? Well, the first thing you have to do is, with most portals, is that you have to register an account. So this is really no different than any account you would register, say at Walmart or Amazon. You go in, you have your name, email address, and a password. For first time you come into the portal and set up your account, you will need to answer some security questions. So that's set up there for you for your protection. And then once you register the account, it's pretty simple and straightforward. Then you'll get a registration confirmation in an email, which is similar to what you see there. If you are the owner or that financially responsible party, that responsible official, remember, you will, for the first time, come in and do identity proofing for yourself. And this essentially replaces that notarial act. Remember how you had to have the paper form notarized? Well, this essentially replaces that. It's done once per user. You fill it out. Within a few seconds, you get a result. It's easy, fast, and convenient. This is a portion of our homepage, and just to kind of let you bring it to your attention that we have edited that homepage to provide the call out that you see there at the bottom, and it talks about how to go back to the digital Access DEQ digital hub for a central hub or repository for all your permits. And then it also provides and gives you a link to our forms page, which will provide you with the instructions, which I'm going to show you here. I'm going to next more or less walk you through the process and show you very briefly just a kind of a sneak peek about what the portal is. So if this works, then we should be good to go. So this is the DEQ hub. As you can see, we only have 2 programs up there so far. We will be populated more in the future. There's a lot of online resources on this particular page here. The permit directory, which is quite helpful. Application tracker for some programs. E-payments, we're collecting payments electronically now. Permitting assistance, of course, and the rules and regulations regarding your certificate or permit. And then we have plenty of user guides available online, and we're actually going to link to the ones. This is now our forms page. It's totally been revamped with separate instructions. The first paragraph is an introductory one. The next 2 paragraphs under forms are essentially telling you what this portal can do for you. And then below there, you'll see the Access DEQ link to back to the hub. I'm highlighting here the documents. We have a quick start guide as well as detailed step-by-step instructions to walk you through the portal. That goes back to the Access DEQ hub. These are our guidance documents, which have always been on our forms page. The only thing I'm going to show you new is that now we've added this flow chart to help you navigate between our erosion control permit and the NCG01 or the construction stormwater general permit. So that's a new document we put on our forms page, but now we're going to jump directly into the portal. So we're going to log in with my credentials, but if you have never registered before, you're going to want to set up that account like I just showed you on the previous slide. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to log in with my credentials. And what it does is open up to my profile page. You can see all my profile details in here. I've been identity proofed, even though I don't need to be necessarily because I'm staff. But there's some menu items to help you manage your account over to the left-hand side, and a contact us link as well if you get stuck. These are the facilities or project sites or locations for which I am affiliated and have access to. This link up at the top will explain to you, is a helpful link to explain to you what is a facility site or project. We kind of went over that. And then the roles that we abbreviated in a slide previously. So there's that information. And then you can request access to that particular location. If you don't have access to it or one hasn't been created, and there will be a lot of that being that there's a new system, then you will be able to create the details of that project site, as we call it in our program. So this is where you would do that, and you can see all of the project sites that are in the system already. I'm just going to select one, and then I can finish my application from there, answer a few questions. So I'll select Hope County Schools, and you'll see how it auto-populates there. There's a lot of that in the portal. You'll answer the question, are you the responsible official? If you are, you'll move on. If you're not, you'll request access to that particular owner's site and details. So moving on from there, we'll just kind of show you what else we've got available. You can submit a complaint there. Again, the permit directory, we're the only one in there right now, but you can start your application directly from that permit application. From that permit directory. Show you some other things. What I'm going to do is show you some of my applications that I'm involved in here. So you can go in and see all of your applications that are specific to your login credentials. You can see the status of them as well. Very convenient to have all these. I mean, for everything, not just erosion sediment control, but for everything. I'm going to take a look at one that's already been issued. So I want to look at the details of that. And so you can see there's a status bar. It tells you where you are and where your progress is in review of that plan and the application. And then what I'm going to do is scroll down and show you one that is in draft. So a new pending submission, and instead of viewing the details, I want to go in and actually edit that because I can, because it's in that status mode. There you go. There's what you should recognize as our financial responsibility and ownership form. The first paragraph in there explains to you, it kind of helps you fill out and prepare those details for that project location or project site. And then I'm going to go in and then I would select it from here. These are all the ones that are affiliated with me from my login credentials. And then of course we want to make sure that we answer the question of, is it an ARPA funded project? Nice little calendar widget here. And then we start adding step one of that FRO form. We start adding information for the contacts within the system, and I can add contact information here. And then move on to the next steps in the application process. So this is where you would add your landowner information, financially responsible parties involved with the project, your registered agents, your supporting documents. So that would be your plans, your calculations, your deed. And then you would review and submit that. You have an opportunity to do that. And step 7 is your confirmation. Once you submit that. Some other things, in this particular system, you will get an invoice to let you know how much you need to pay for your project. And that will be handled, and you can view all of your invoices through the system with all of your permit applications that you're affiliated with. So this is just kind of showing you. Now that list will get rather long as you continue to work with us. And so this is how you can manipulate your views to be able to go in and find some of that data and do some data mining for yourself to find whatever invoices you need there, as well as your permit applications. This would be a list of permits if I had any in here. All the ones that have been issued, in other words. And that's pretty much it. So one of the things that I did just kind of want to point out here is that there is a status bar. We kind of went over it briefly, but you can, a couple of things. We do have permit application numbers now, in addition to project IDs or permit numbers in the system. So that's something that's new. But you can review the status and go in and review the status of your application, look at your permits. The application of the status of your application, you can log in and look at that 24/7. And that's what you'll see in one of those steps there. Oh, skip it. Okay. So what are the benefits of electronic plan submittals? Some of you who've been working in electronic permitting systems know this for a while, but essentially the application has been streamlined to ask you targeted questions that concerning your specific project. And that makes the process a little easier to navigate. You don't have to fill out all the forms, all the blanks on the paper form. So applicants will be able to track the status of their application that we just mentioned. Public record requests are going to be handled more efficiently, increasing transparency and thus access to information. The system offers added convenience with its new online credit card payment option. And that will be very beneficial because starting July 1st of 2025, our permit fees are going to be tied to inflation. So every 4 years, there's a potential that our fees could change. And with this system, I can go in and change those fees when that occurs much more conveniently, instantaneously, and it will be effective on a specific date throughout all of our regional offices. And then finally, one of the benefits of going online is that we are expecting integration of our online application with that from the construction stormwater general permit or the NCG01 permit, as you're accustomed to. Their application is online, but it will be integrated with ours. That's what they use for their electronic notice of intent to apply for that permit. So that will be integrated with ours sooner rather than later. And I think, there's been a lot of effort put into this. I just wanted to take just a minute here just to thank the people, the support team that we've had from DIT, as well as from some of our other divisions who have pitched in to try to make this project as successful and as streamlined, as convenient as possible. So that ends my presentation. And if you have any questions at this point, I will attempt to address those. Five minutes.
The first question from an online attendee is, will you still be requiring a wet signature on FRO forms?
No, if you're using the portal to apply, that's what that identity proofing takes the place of, the notary piece, and then the wet signatures. No, you're assigning and testing, and that's why you have security questions in the system. You answer security questions and it more or less verifies your identity. So that is, electronic signatures, and we have laws in the state for those as well. That will suffice.
Will Demler be using Bluebeam Studio for plan review similar to the state construction office, and will it be available to the preparer if so?
Not that I'm aware of. No, we're just submitting those through PDF, through uploads through that system. I didn't show you that particular page, but it was one of the 7 steps there in the application.
Sounds like the applicant / financially responsible party will have to register separately from the engineer / consultant. Is that correct?
That's correct. We are essentially having those 2 parties in the system, and they will be essentially, we're kind of reversing the order. Normally, with a typical paper application, the consultant will go in, prepare the application, give it to the financially responsible party for them to get notarized and sign and return it to us. That situation has more or less been reversed in this process.
Is there a standard permit that is issued from the online system after plan approval?
Standard permit. You would receive the same documentation that you receive traditionally in that sense. You get a letter of approval and you get a certificate of plan approval as well. And that will be emailed to you. Everything is going to be more or less emailed and communications as opposed to mailing, with the exception of those documents that have to be sent by certified mail and tracked. That's all the questions online. No questions from the audience. Okay. Yes, Javon. Do you have, you're asking if you have access to all the reports online? You have a lot more access than you did or would have previously. You know, anything that's available as public record requests can be given to you, whether they're, you saw their applications, you can see there, you can see your permits, those documents there, invoices, of course. Not everything is 100% online, but certainly you have more capability of seeing what you can versus what you did in the future with the paper base where we had to retrieve that information for you. So you can see a lot more with your login credentials, including the status of, you know, all your permits. And it's not just for erosion control, but it's for every other permit certificate or authorization that you need to receive from DEQ. Yes. So he's asking if we have a date by which this our design manual is going to be finished. And again, that process is that it's worked on by that committee and submitted to us for a kind of a final editing and cleanup, and then submitted to the commission for approval, and they have to vote on that. We, again, don't have a hard deadline. Not sure if the chairman has a hard deadline on that, seeing how we kind of got our progress. Again, we've only done 11 practice standards out of about 52. So it'll probably be, I would say, venture to guess, a few more years. But we are trying to go at a pace that's not too slow, but making sure that it's, but making sure that we're, you know, capturing all the essence and giving our due diligence. We have contractors on that. We have design engineers, and, you know, they all have different perspectives. So I can't give you a hard and fast date at this point. And Rebecca says she's our moderator for the meetings, that we do have to release it in sections.
Another question, can you clarify when invoices are received?
Can I clarify when invoices are received? Invoices are received by the applicant once we've conducted a completeness review of your plan and determined that you have everything that you need in order to start the review. So those will be the essential documents. And then we send that invoice out saying that we have everything. We can now conduct a preliminary review of your plan. And then we send that out to you and you'll make payment, and you can do that instantaneously online. Yep. Okay, go ahead. Yeah. So a lot of our documentation is sent out in an email electronically, but we still have that requirement to send those out and have to be tracked, as do you guys. So in those instances, the system will auto-generate that letter, but it will still have to be mailed out at this particular point in time. I think there is some legislation that does allow us to be able to send electronically now, but has not been but when we started this process, it wasn't in place. And so right now we're trying to just, you know, get the thing cleaned up and finished. And so At some point in the future, we're looking to be able to, hopefully that will be an easy adoption to be able to do electronically. But as far as I can tell, that's only applicable to the state and not to the local programs at this point in time. Yes, John. No, that was not in their scope of work. We will still be operating in our existing system for any existing projects that were started or approved in the old system will remain there throughout the life of their project. So fortunately, our projects are temporary, right? They're kind of one and done. Not that we don't have revisions, right? But once a project is finished, it's closed. Whereas some other facilities and within our project that are going to be there indefinitely, that will be more of an issue, and they will probably have to figure out how to transition over. But our agreement with DIT was not to transfer all of that data over. Now we do have access to it through this system and fortunately in a different light, which is easier to get to, and we can see things that we couldn't see as easily before. But to answer your question, they are still separate systems. Unfortunately, our staff will have to work in those dual systems and get those projects out through attrition.
Any further questions can be asked of Julie during one of the breaks, and we will have her answer any further questions that are online on one of our Zooms. Thank you, Julie. I got it. Let me just close this out if I can find the mouse. Our next presenter is Mike Lawyer of NCDEQ. He is the Stormwater Program Head, and he will be presenting updates on the NCG01.
Thank you, Rebecca. Good morning. For those of you that don't know me, Rebecca did introduce me, but I'm Mike Lawyer. I'm the current Stormwater Program Supervisor within the Dimler Central Office. Just a little quick background. I started in this position in March of this year. Prior to that, I worked in our Fayetteville Regional Office for roughly 17, 18 years. So I've been within the department and the division for quite a while, focusing mainly on stormwater, but I have familiarity with erosion control and some of our other Dimler programs. But today I'm going to be briefly talking about updates on the NCG01 or NCG01 Construction Stormwater General Permit. It's referred to several different ways. It kind of goes along, as Julie mentioned, and everybody should be familiar with. Once you get an erosion and sedimentation control approval, you also have to obtain coverage under that NCG01 Construction Stormwater General Permit. That permit is set to expire the end of March of next year. Just real quickly, we do also have our NCG 25, which is another construction stormwater general permit that applies to projects that are not subject to the SPCA, the Sedimentation Pollution Control Act, but are subject to the Clean Water Act. Those types of projects would be fairly rare. But just to note that NCG 25 permit is set to expire the end of May of 24, but our plan right now is to renew both the NCG 01 and 25 on April 1st. As Julie alluded to with that PTP or Permitting Transformation Program and Access DEQ, we are focusing and working on. Is there a problem? I'm not talking loud enough. Can everybody hear me? Can you hear me in the back? All right, thank you. So we are focusing on that sort of combined electronic application process, sort of streamlining that. So currently you get an erosion sediment control approval either through the regional office or local program, then have to submit an electronic notice of intent through the central office to get the NCG01 coverage. And so we are working with the development team to kind of streamline that, combine that in with the process that Julie went over. So that being said, we are looking to renew the NCG 01 and 25 permit essentially as is without any significant changes. I know there have been some significant changes during previous renewals, but with our efforts to do that streamlining process, we're not going to propose any significant changes. There will likely be some minor corrections, as I've kind of termed it there, or maybe clarifications. And I've listed a few examples there. Right now, the current 01 permit provides an exclusion for landfills that are under the NCG 12. That was actually an oversight during the last 01 renewal. Landfills that have to get an erosion and sedimentation control approval do also have to get coverage under the NCG 01. So we'll make that correction. We're going to clarify that a rain gauge or other rain monitoring device should be on site, on the job site. We receive questions about that quite often, about this other rain monitoring device, if that can be online weather data or the local airport. And, you know, really it should be a rain monitoring device, you know, either a gauge like a plastic rain gauge or electronic device, weather station on the job site. So we'll make that clarification. Occasionally, if, you know, project managers, superintendents, if that's something they want to work with their regional office staff on, if there is maybe a rain gauge relatively close by that they can verify, that the regional office staff can verify, that you might can get regional office approval to use something like that. And then secondary containment requirements for above ground storage of petroleum products. So most construction projects will have or bring in sort of temporary tanks for fueling of their equipment. If they're over a certain capacity threshold, there are federal requirements that you provide appropriate secondary containment, dig out a small pit and line it. So that requirement's really already out there, the federal SPCC regulations, and our permit basically talks about, you know, the proper operation and maintenance and handling of oils and fuels and lubricants, et cetera. So we'll clarify that. And one other quick thing is the current 01 permit, when it was issued, is when we first went to that E&OI process, and also when we first started charging what was $100 fee, initial and annual, which is now $120 fee for those that don't know. So there's language in the current permit that says that projects that were covered previously are sort of have continued coverage under the new permit, but didn't have to pay the fee. So we'll obviously need to correct that, because every project now that's gone through and obtained a certificate of coverage will have to pay that initial and annual fee. So we are in the process right now of seeking some input from kind of a select group of stakeholders regarding sort of the current permit. We're not doing a formal stakeholder process with just multiple meetings and stuff, because honestly, we just don't have time to do that. We have to renew this permit before it expires. We'll plan to put out a draft permit in early 2024, likely sometime in January. That'll be out for public comment, so any and all folks can review it and provide comment. And of course, we'll review those comments and take those into consideration before finalizing the permit. As far as that combined electronic process, I don't have much of a status update to give you right now, because it's still very, very in the works. But we will soon be conducting some internal UAT or user testing, again, to ensure a successful system for all. And right now, the sort of projected go live, and this would be for that, you go through the access DEQ for your erosion control, and then also NCG 01 coverage. It's currently kind of on slate to happen after the NCG 01 permit renewal, so after April 1st, so late April, early May timeframe. And that's really all I have. I did put my contact information here. Anybody needs that, and then, yeah, open it up to questions. Yes, sir. For DOT projects, yes. For private projects, not initially, not by the permit. It needs to be an on-site rain gauge. But like I said, that's something where the project manager could potentially discuss with regional staff. That may be something they can work out if there's one really close by and they can sort of verify. But yeah, DOT is different. They're allowed to use that system that you talked about. Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, the question was, there's been a program or allowance for certain weather stations throughout the state that DOT can use. And the question was if that can continue to be used, which again, assuming if you're asking continue to be used for DOT projects, yes. For private, projects, not initially, it should be an on-site rain gauge, but potentially. Yes, sir. Yeah, can you repeat the first part of your question? Which permit condition you're referring to? Okay, you're talking about on the self-inspection forms where there's corrective action taken? Okay, so the question is on the self-inspection, self-monitoring forms for construction projects, there's a section there for like corrective action taken. And basically saying that any corrective action should be taken as soon as possible. And you're asking if there's any sort of defined time frame. Right. So the answer I'm going to give you may not be the most desirable answer, but it depends. It depends on what the situation is. So obviously, if you got a big plug of sediment down in a creek, as soon as possible means right now. Right. If it's, silt fence blown out or knocked down or whatever, again, that may depend on what level of stabilization there is in that area. Is that something that the silt fence needs to be put back up and fixed within an hour or by the end of the workday? And I think that's why we say as soon as possible, because again, it really depends on the situation that's occurred, the project specifics, the location of the project. Is it flat? Is there, steep slopes? So again, I know that's not the best answer to your question, but we kind of leave that up, I guess, to the project manager or the responsible party to determine the severity of, the deficiency or the issue that's occurred and when that action, the corrective action should be taken.
I think I've seen other language written somewhere, if it's not specifically there, that has usually been said that if not done as soon as possible before the next significant rainfall event occurs.
Yeah, which again, a lot of times you may not know when that's going to happen. I mean, obviously we all look at the weather report, but they're not 100% accurate. So thank you, Julie.
Question from online. To confirm, DEQ does not intend to include 2022 EPA requirements for qualified inspectors or turbidity monitoring in the 2024 renewal?
That's correct. We do not intend to do that, either of those things.
Another question is, will these changes affect local programs that do not have jurisdiction over NCGO one?
Which changes are they referring to? The application process, the new application process?
The new permit, I believe.
Well, I guess I'll answer that question this way. So at least as of right now, and until we're maybe potentially directed otherwise by like EPA, because the NCGO one permit is part of the NPDS, federal program, we cannot legally sort of hand that down to local governments or local programs. That remains with the state. So local governments or the delegated local programs would still obviously have their erosion control program and can do inspections regarding that, but not inspect for conditions, not formally inspect conditions of the NCGO one. Certainly you can kind of look at those things, but the NCGO one permitting, inspection and compliance will remain with the state. As far as the new streamlined application process goes, plans that are submitted to the regional office, like I said, it'll be eventually a combined kind of system for erosion control and NCGO one coverage. For the locally delegated programs, when you approve an erosion control plan, that responsible official or that FRO will then have to come through into the system to get their NCGO one coverage kind of independently. Hopefully that answers that question. Yeah.
No other questions online at the moment.
Okay. Any other questions from the audience here? Okay. Well, thank you for your time and attention. I plan to be here pretty much the rest of the day. So if you do have something that comes up, find me during a break and we can discuss further. All right. Thank you.
All right, we are going to take approximately a 15-minute break at this point. So we will come back at approximately 9:35. Thank you. We will begin in a minute if you would all find your seats. All right, if I could have everyone's attention. Our next presenter is Doug Ansel of NCDEQs. He is one of our Assistant General Counsel to the North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality. And he will be presenting on the stormwater and sediment legislative updates. Thank you, Doug.
Good morning, everyone. Everybody hear me? Excellent. As most of you, or those of you who do know me, I don't have a problem talking. So if you can't hear me, well, I'll speak up. It won't be an issue whether we have the mic or not. So as Rebecca said, my name is Doug Ansel. I'm an Assistant General Counsel for DEQ. I've been with the agency for about 9 years now. I've worked with a variety of different divisions, Demler being one of my primary divisions that I advise. But I also have worked with DWR's, a variety of different programs within DWR. Currently, I'm still working with their grant program. I work with our Division of Mitigation Services, our Financial Services Division, the Stewardship Program, Internal Audit, and used to deal with animal operations, CAFOs, and a multitude of other DWR issues that have come up over the years. I think some of you probably heard about a little thing called coal ash that we had going on for quite a while that took a lot of my time when I first started with the agency. So if you've never reached out to me before, which hopefully you haven't, you don't have my email address, phone number, got them here. Anything comes up, you're welcome to reach out. Generally speaking, we recommend that for the Office of General Counsel that you have your lawyers contact us, just because if you are represented ethically, we need to end up working with them on any of the issues that come up. But we do work with the regulated community, local governments all the time. Legal questions come up in a variety of different scenarios, and we're here as a resource both to the agency as well as people outside the agency when there are issues coming up that pertain to what we do. In true lawyer fashion, we're going to start out with a disclaimer. First things first is this is not legal advice. This is an informational update for everybody here. If you have any legal questions that you need advice on, you need to talk to your counsel. I cannot give you legal advice. I am not your counsel. Again, I'm not your counsel. I cannot give any of you legal advice. The other piece to this is there's a lot of text. I've broken probably every rule that comes up when we talk about how we are supposed to give presentations, that every one of these slides has the statutes directly copied. I've copied them from what the session laws said. This is not what the revisor of statutes has put online because that hasn't happened yet. But if anything comes up and there are questions, look at the way the statutes are written once the revisor posts those online. So one of the other pieces I will say up front, this presentation, everything that you're going to see up here, you don't have to read everything that is on the screen. It's going to have a lot of text. They say that a picture is worth 1,000 words. I've taken kind of the opposite approach of 1,000 words equals a picture. You see a lot of presentations that have pictures. In my world, we deal with text. So you're going to see pictures effectively illustrated through text. We're drawing directly from the session law, and I'll talk about what those session laws say. So the 2023 long session is basically wrapped up at this point. It's not officially closed, but for the most part, things have kind of wound down at this stage. It was a pretty busy session. We had 761 Senate bills. that were proposed, as well as 898 House bills. Out of that, we ended up with 151 session laws that have been ratified at this point, have gone to the reviser of statutes. So of those 151, how many are we going to talk about today? We're only going to go through 5. Don't worry. We are going to probably go through in pretty good detail on these 5, but at the end of the day, it's just 5. We won't talk about the other 146. So of these 5, every one of these is going to deal with sedimentation and stormwater. The crux of this for some of these is that it's more of just a reference for you than anything else, that they aren't likely to impact you. Others definitely will impact you as we are going forward as implementing both the stormwater and sedimentation programs. We kick things right off at the beginning with a pretty minor one overall, that we've got certain airport authorities that have been given the option now that instead of going through the state, which they used to have to do, they now can work with local governments that have an approved local program. They've got a couple requirements that you can see down in A1 that talk about that they have to enact a resolution. They've got to provide notice to the commission. For the most part, that's not going to affect you. If they have been approved as a local program and they are electing to utilize this, it'll just mean that instead of going to the state for things related to the airport, you're going to go to the local program. Jumping right into Session Law 2023-108, we had building code amendments and land development regulations. Got 4 different sections that come up here that have the potential to affect what you do, depending on whether it is sedimentation or stormwater. So in Section 10, they talked about a fee clarification, that what you'll see is they've basically said that you now have the option, and this is at the option of the applicant, to either pay a per acre fee or a per lot fee when you're dealing with single family homes that are on 1 acre or less, or sorry, on less than 1 acre. There is a cap of $100 for that. So again, the applicant has the option now, as opposed to the local government having the option. Section 11, we had a directive from the General Assembly where they've basically asked the DEQ prepare a plan that would streamline erosion and sedimentation plan approvals and the certificates of coverage under the NCGO1 permits to reduce costs, delays, and efficiently use staff resources. At this point, DEQ has already developed that. Stay tuned to see where things go with discussions from EPA on that topic. Section 13. One of the things the General Assembly took interest in this year is the idea of whether or not local governments could require for stormwater permits and stormwater systems to have fees associated with future maintenance and restoration, repair, et cetera, on these systems. And what they said is that in D1, they said that you can have a regulation that requires the property owner to have the money set aside, but you couldn't require them to pay the fees to the local government. So it doesn't mean that there's no money set aside. It just means that it's not the local government that's going to be collecting the money and holding on to it. So the idea is so that the usage fees are still there, but if you are requiring fees specifically for the actual repair, maintenance, et cetera, that they've got that kind of, the idea is that if you've got to rebuild these. So they have effectively said, you've still got the money that needs to, or you can require the money to be held, but it's not going to be the local government that's holding that. 13.1 jumped into the idea of permit transfers. We've seen a lot of interest in permit transfers over the years. If we've got time at the end, I'll mention a little bit about some of the changes that were made to permit transfers and requirements for permit transfers in years past. It's not something that happened this year, but it'll just kind of depend on how we are doing on time. What they've said here is that local governments that are issuing stormwater permits have to transfer those permits the same way that the state transfers theirs. So any requirement the state has, a local government's going to have to do the same thing. It's a pretty simple change. They only changed a couple words here, but it effectively just broadens it to be not just DEQ, but local governments as well. This really just said the same thing. They expanded it into other parts of the general statutes to make it clear that it's all going to be done in the exact same fashion for local governments and the state. At-risk construction permitting is a new one. It's, in some ways, it's a fairly minor update regarding the SPCA, but it is a new permitting option that is far broader with its overall effects. I'd recommend that if this is something that affects you, you go back and look at that. We're only going to talk about it from the sedimentation stormwater side to things today, but it is something that there is a fairly broad potential impact, I think, on the way that people do business. It's just not something that's really the topic of what we're going through today. So effectively what they have done here, and I have stripped out all of the non-sedimentation pieces. This section 2A is far, far longer than what you see on this slide. But we've got a new at-risk building permit option. With respect to the SPCA, you've got to have an ENSC plan approval in order to receive that initial foundation permit that it talks about there in H1. So the at-risk building foundation permit is where things start, and you can't get that without having your SPCA plan approval. So the General Assembly has also said that local governments can't withhold that plan approval just because other approvals are needed. Goal here is you can't do an end run around having this plan approval, that you are if you get in the plan approval is not going to be contingent on all of these other things. And you start with that. That's the first step. This at-risk approach is a different concept in many ways. And so as a result, they're saying you do this much, you can get your permit. I think that's where you get into the at-risk concept. Oh, sorry. So the question was, what happens if circumstances change? And really the effect of that is if circumstances change, then it doesn't meet the concept of at-risk. This section overall has a lot more detail to it. And I would highly recommend that if you're looking into that or you've got questions about that, look at everything that's in the act there, because they go into a lot more detail and all the different pieces to it as well. It's okay. So here, E really is just another way of saying that, once you get your plan approval, you can start building under this at-risk option. Looking at the Appropriations Act, we had a lot of different things that came out of that. The Appropriations Act, as I think everybody has seen, are not small documents. I think it was something like 700 pages long this year. There's a lot of different things that go on in there. When we get into sediment, stormwater, and general operations at DEQ, they cover a lot of different things. It's not just going to be things that are solely associated with budgetary elements, but it is something that falls within the new Appropriations Act. So with this bill and with the reg reform bill that we're going to talk about, we got a lot more going on in it, obviously, than the first three bills we talked about. Kind of blew through those pretty quick. These next two bills dig a little bit more into the day-to-day operations of how the state functions with our different sediment and stormwater programs. So the first three here in section 1210 effectively do the same thing as section 2D of the statute that we were just talking about. It basically says that you're not going to refuse an application for an ENSC plan or a permit in general based on the idea that you've got to get other permits. That we're going to say that for DEQ's purposes, if you're coming in, every permit is going to be standalone. It broadly applies to all of DEQ. The permitting order isn't going to matter when it comes to acceptance of an application. So this is something we're going to see far beyond both the SPCA and stormwater, but for your purposes, the idea is that everything is going to be standalone. The only thing that you're going to see is certain specifics to how this applies. No, no, the way that the law is written, it explicitly says DEQ shall not refuse. So the only way that's going to apply is if you've got somewhere else in the law that specifically says a local government shall be subject to the same requirements as DEQ. So if you've got effectively incorporation by reference, then it's going to apply, but that's going to be frankly on a case-by-case basis. When we look at B, this gets still into this idea of how does this get applied to the SPCA? So just like in section 1210A and in the 2023-142, the ENSC plan is standalone aside from the NCGO1. And this was kind of what I was getting at a little bit earlier, that in the language here, what they are adding is that it's can be approved upon the condition of getting all other necessary permits, but you can't refuse to accept it because they haven't received these other permits. As you've seen with all of our plans already, they're already conditioned on compliance with state and federal law whenever we are doing any of these approvals. So this really just extends that further to say, you've also got to get all of your permits at the same time. Obviously, that's fairly intuitive, but they're spelling it out here. One thing I will point out, just to back up very briefly on this, for those of you that aren't used to reading statutes, when you look at this and you see anything that's underlined, that is new text that has been added to the statute. If it's got a strike through, that's things they're deleting. As a lawyer, I think about that, or I don't actually think about that when I read things. I am just used to it, but I know not everybody is as enthralled with reading statutes and session laws as I typically am. Sorry. Mhm. Mhm. Not necessarily. What it's really done here is it's said that we can't deny based on not receiving any of that. So they still have to go and get all of those things. And what they're really doing is saying that each one of these actions is fully independent. Sorry, she was asking about with 404, 401 permits, if that's something that, because this is listed, they're talking about the applicant's receipt of those permits in the last piece that they added. And the answer is no, it really doesn't change whether or not we can ask for that, aside from saying, sorry, it doesn't change whether we can ask for it. It says that we can't have that as a requirement whenever we are going through the application or the plan approval process, that if we're going to have a plan that we review, then it has to be done independently of all of these other things, except for the NCGO1. It's probably going to depend on the context. Sorry, the question was whether that applies to jurisdictional determinations. And the answer is, in typical lawyer fashion, it depends. And the reason I say that is when you are doing a plan review, if you have an element of the plan that is incumbent upon what that JD says, then it's going to be hard to say that it is not effectively a prerequisite. So it's not necessarily that in and of itself, the JD is required first, but it's that if you have a JD that changes the way the ENSC plan is drawn or approved, then you now have a plan that doesn't match circumstances. So it's to the question earlier, change circumstances. So the question was about buffer authorizations, and the short answer is I'm not sure. That's what we need to look into. But I would say generally the way I would look at it is if you have a plan approval that or another permit that changes your circumstances, the recommendation would be to probably get that first. But according to what the law says now, DEQ cannot deny or refuse a plan approval because you don't have those. But if you get that after the fact and it changes what your site plan looks like, you're going to have to go back and modify your ENSC plan. As Julie said, the potential is there for lots of revisions. So, and finally here in 1210C, it basically says the same thing, that local governments are subject to the same requirements. So we were talking earlier about things that DEQ has to do. And so here, this is one that I apologize. I misspoke earlier. I got ahead of myself, but they have applied it to local governments. So take back what I said earlier, and we're just going to roll with that because there's a lot of it here that the General Assembly has done this year. And so I apologize for not having everything at the forefront of my memory. We jump into stormwater. So kind of shifting gears a little bit from sedimentation. Section 1212 gets into effectively a new approach to how we are going to be reviewing stormwater permit applications. And what this does is it really sets out a new calendar for how everything is done. Currently, everything is done on a 90-day calendar basis. So if you submit an application, we've got 90 days to review it. Then we have an ADI, we send it back to you asking for that additional information. You respond, we have a new 90-day clock. And so it rolls. It has the potential to draw things out to a pretty great extent, depending on how many ADIs there are. And generally, the regulated community was not very happy with that. So one of the things that came out of the General Assembly this year in talking with the agency was shifting from this 90-90-90 approach to what we're generally referring to as a 70-30-30. So when we look at this, the idea is that the agency's got 10 days to decide if an application is administratively complete right at the outset. If it is, the clock will have started when the application first came in. So it's not a 10-70-30-30, it's 70-30-30. So the 70-day clock starts the day we received it if it was complete. If it wasn't complete, send it back and you got to try again. When the 70-day clock starts, we have 70 days to review everything that you submitted. If we decide that an ADI is needed, then we shift into the 30-day clock. Once we have decided an ADI is required, we send it back to the applicant. The applicant has 30 days to respond to the agency. When you respond to the agency now has 30 days to review your response and either approve, deny, or ask for additional information. This can continue back and forth depending on how many ADIs there are and how thorough the responses are. One of the things that has come out of this is the idea that when we're going through this review, in lawyer speak, it's much like cross-examination and direct examination. If I ask a question on direct, then the other attorney on cross can only ask questions that pertain to what I asked on direct. Each time it's going to get narrower and narrower. So theoretically, the realm of information on the ADIs as we go through these subsequent 30-day response periods is going to get smaller and smaller as we are kind of moving our way through the entire process. I think it skipped a page. Maybe it didn't. Maybe I skipped a page. So the other piece that comes out of this is at the end of the process, if the agency finds something and says, hey, we realized that we made a mistake, we should have asked about something and we didn't. And because of this new provision that says we can't go back and ask about new information as we're going through the process, what we can do is we can either modify the permit when it's issued, or we can make it a permit condition. So it doesn't necessarily take it off the table, but it says we can't deny the permit as a result of that. The other piece to this is, just like before, when we hit the end of that clock, if the agency hasn't taken action on that 70-day period or a subsequent 30-day period, the permit is deemed approved. If an applicant fails to respond within their 30-day window, the opposite happens. It's automatically deemed denied. So this is something that it becomes incumbent on all parties to be very careful and watch their clocks as they're going through. It's not just an open-ended clock for anybody. Everybody has a strict timeline so that we can keep the process moving forward for both the applicant as well as for the agency. Probably going to depend on the specifics to what that permit is looking at. So it's not necessarily saying you have to get this permit, but it's saying that if you need to prove an element in order to get the permit that you are applying for, then you're still going to have to do that. So it's not that you have to get a separate permit, but if there are specific pieces you've got to demonstrate, you're still going to have to demonstrate those. As long as it's not requesting a separate permit, that's what the General Assembly has said, is that they haven't taken anything out of what is required for a permit, aside from saying that you can't make it contingent on receiving other permits and therefore refusing an application because you haven't received those permits to start. Fast track in stormwater is another one. We've seen fast track in a lot of different areas. In stormwater, fast track is something that's been around for a while. Not a lot of people use it. There've been a lot of problems with it. And so the General Assembly has eliminated fast track. So at this point, we're not going to see any new things. We're closing out the old sites and kind of in many ways closing the door on this experiment. Overall, the only thing that really matters in 20.5A, when we talk about state property and land use regulation, is that if you are working on a state project, the state's got to consult with the local government before they take action. They have to talk about specifically the stormwater implications. There are a lot of other things they've got to consult on. For what we're talking about today, stormwater implications are one of those elements now that for state projects, there has to be a conversation at least with the local government. It can't be something that is just completely ignored. Express permitting got a fair amount of interest this year from the General Assembly. So here in A, what the General Assembly is doing is effectively allowing the agency to create additional express options where it deems it appropriate. Nothing really new at this time. There's not something we can report and say, hey, there's new express options coming from these different areas, but it's given the agency the flexibility to create them if they need to have it, or they say, hey, this is an area that we can actually make a difference in improving where things stand. B is actually a bit of a bigger deal. So where before the agency didn't have rules for express, now the General Assembly is requiring rules be adopted by July 1st, 2025. As that process kicks off, stay tuned. You'll be hearing a lot more as things really get underway. The nice thing the General Assembly did, though, is despite requiring that permanent rulemaking occur for express, they did say that in the meantime, we can still operate under all of the policies and procedures that are in place. So don't expect anything to change regarding these policies and procedures, but the agency gets to continue to implement them, and we have a legal backing for doing that. If anything does change, it's not going to happen without 30 days notice. Turning to 1214A, we can see the new fee schedule for stormwater. Specifically, you're going to want to look at subdivision 10. It's going to talk about kind of what the different pieces are that we have with respect to stormwater. So I'm not going to read everything to you. I think really the one that most people are probably interested in is if we're talking about an NCGO 1, the new fee for that is $120. So as before, we haven't changed anything when it comes to annual fees. It's still in the sense that your first year's application fee is still the same as your initial annual fee. That annual fee obviously gets paid every single year, kind of by definition, but the idea is that your first year is paid with your application fee. When it comes to state stormwater permits, one of the things that the General Assembly has done is instead of a one-size-fits-all approach, we've got a tiered structure. It's going to be based on SCMs being evaluated, and it's going to kind of, so we've got it broken out into if you've got 1 or less, 2, 3, and then 4 or more. So sliding scale, obviously, the more SCMs there are, the more review time is required. So it makes sense to have a different fee structure, because if you've got somebody that has 1 SCM and somebody that has 6, it's not going to be the same evaluation process in terms of time. We've also got fees that were added in relating to minor mods, renewal and transfer, renewal or transfer, as well as new coverage under a general permit. One thing I will point out is that in E, with new coverage under a general permit, that does not apply to the NCGO 1. The NCGO 1 is covered in the prior subdivision 10 section that we talked about at the $120. It's not $700 a year for an NCGO 1. Take a breath. In 1214P, this is a little bit more of an exciting one, I think, for everybody, regulated community as well as state legislators and the agency. What the General Assembly has done now is they've established a new 4-year cadence of fee adjustments based on inflation. And they're doing this through looking at the Consumer Price Index. This is going to include both the SPCA as well as stormwater fees. Nobody likes fee increases. Everybody gets that. But this is the best way to ensure that fees don't lose value due to inflation, and thus ensure that the agency can actually continue to perform its statutory duties in evaluating everything by making sure that there's enough money to cover the people to do the reviews. Everybody knows the problems that have occurred at different times in terms of review time based on the lack of staffing that the agency has been suffering for a number of years, but has really hit a height in the last several years. This is the General Assembly's approach to say, look, the fairest way to do this is let's tie it to inflation, and it will affect everybody equally going forward. And it's going to happen every 4 years. It's not a 1-year thing. It's not a 10-year thing. It's going to be on a 4-year cadence. One of the big things I think a lot of people ask on this is, are these retroactive? If you look at that very last sentence in D, they've said nothing is retroactive. If you have applied for a permit or you've paid a fee of any kind, once you have that submitted, the agency's not going to come back and say, hey, fees went up and we haven't finished reviewing this, so pay more. If you've submitted it, you're done. You're basically grandfathered in at that point. So our final session law is the reg reform bill from this year. Reg reform can cover a lot of different things. We had basically 6 different sections that applied to sedimentation and stormwater this year. Some of those are smaller, some are a little bit bigger. We talk about water supply, watershed. The exemption that we've had for exceeding density has been adjusted and clarified this year so that only excludes the net increase in BUA from pre-existing development. It's still the idea that this is at the election of the property owner. It's not something that the agency is deciding, but it's clear that the property owner can decide that if they want to, they can subject everything to it with this net increase calculation. Stormwater, again, gets some more attention outside of just water supply watershed. When we look here in B2.2, it's fairly straightforward. It's basically saying that any portion of a project within a DOT or municipal right-of-way is not considered to be impervious area. B3, they're effectively coming back and saying that you can only require new stormwater controls for redevelopment exceeding pre-existing impervious, regardless of whether that pre-existing is demolished or relocated. The idea is it's pre-existing, whether it's in one corner, in the center, on another corner, you've got that same amount of pre-existing BUA. We're going to count that as we move forward in whatever the calculation of your net increase may be. This mirrors the change that we talked about with water supply watershed in section 1. Section 2 goes on in B5. It basically creates a new option for stormwater applicants to also apply to local government programs instead of DEQ. Whereas before, if you had just the DEQ program, you would be applying to DEQ. Here, they're allowing the applicants to choose to go with local governments. There's been a push for people saying that they prefer to work with local governments versus DEQ. Here, the General Assembly is acquiescing to that. When we look at C7, C7 is an interesting one because what they've effectively done is put everybody on the same page and say, look, a permit applicant is only responsible for the project and property that they are working with. They're not responsible for anything around it. There's been confusion in the past as to at what point do things spill over. And the General Assembly has taken a pretty firm stance here to emphasize that it's only the project that you're dealing with, that it's within, and we call it in law the 4 corners rule. When we talk about documents, it's kind of the 4 corners of the property. You stay within the bounds of your property whenever you are getting a stormwater permit application. If there's a problem on a neighboring property, you're not responsible for that. And they took a very hard stance about that this year to make sure that everybody was on the same page when it came to that. And then finally in C8, General Assembly is requiring permit holders to start construction with 5 years. We've seen projects that have lingered and sat there and not been touched, and they had these stormwater permits that were just sitting there. And we've seen things that were 10, 20 years old that either had nothing built on it or had effectively been abandoned, but the permit had never been rescinded, or anybody had come in and said, I want to terminate permit coverage here. And it's caused a lot of problems for the agency as well as property owners. So here, the department's going to be rescinding anything that you haven't started construction on within 5 years. This ties into a lot of concepts when it comes to vested rights and other legal theories based on that same idea. So don't get a permit and sit on it, because you're going to have to, at some point, either come in and get an extension on it, or it's going to be rescinded and you're going to have to start over. So section 3, we're halfway done with this last one. We're almost there. Take a breath. If you need some coffee, I understand. It's not the most interesting thing to listen to a lawyer talk about text, but it's something that we all have to do at times. So I'm sorry. When we talk about fees and stormwater, this section 3 is a pretty minor one. All it's really doing is it's allowing local governments to vary their fee schedules for stormwater management based on the number of SCMs that are in use. To the question that we had earlier about whether we can still have stormwater management fees, this is emphasizing that yes, we can. You just can't have fees tied to this idea of reconstruction or rebuilding to create, in some ways, effectively an endowment, like what we see with conservation easements. So section 4, for the most part, this probably won't impact a lot of folks, but what they've done is expressly said that public linear transportation projects that are undertaken by somebody other than DOT or unit of local government are exempt from the requirements of post-construction stormwater. You're basically looking here at like turn lanes, roads outside of properties. That when you're looking at a road internal to a property, it's not a public linear transportation project. So emphasis there is on public. It's not exempting all roads. It's only exempting those public linear transportation projects. My understanding with that is most of those typically get turned over to DOT afterwards. It's just in many cases a local government condition for getting the subdivision plan that they have to go in and do these turn lanes or add these roads adjacent to the property. So here, the General Assembly is saying, we're not going to require that to be part of the post-construction stormwater. It's eventually going to be part of DOT's MS4 program. Section 5, again, a relatively minor change. It only affects a very small area. We're looking at Mooresville and Iredell County. Historically, water supply watershed has allowed for a 70-20 model in certain areas. With this change, it's being expanded in Iredell County and Mooresville to allow for 20% of the area in question to be developed with BUA. So you've got this 70% idea. You can go up to 70% BUA on these properties. Used to be 10% of the area that was in question with that within that watershed. They're doubling that to 20%. So they're allowing for more BUA within these specific areas. It's still not opening the doors all the way. It's limited to only 20%. And that's something that the local government and the local water supply watershed program has to keep track of. And then finally, with lucky number 13, the agency is going to be including all of its permits where it hasn't been previously, the statutory or regulatory authority for every permit condition. Anytime people have questions and they look at their permit and they say, why is it that the agency is putting this in here, or where does their authority come from? It's going to be in the permits. It should be very clear to everybody going forward if it hadn't been already. No, this is the permit. So the question was, does this apply to ADIs? So the idea is that when the permit is issued, that the permit has to have with its permit condition what the basis for that permit condition is. Some things may be very broad. Some things may be very specific. It's going to depend on what the permit condition looks like. And with that, I think that's everything. And I think even though I had an extra 10 minutes, I've run all the way to the end of my time. So I apologize for drawing it out. Hopefully nobody fell asleep. If you did, I hope it was a good rest. Thank you very much.
If anyone has any questions for Doug, you can find him during one of the breaks. And Doug, if you can sit and answer the one Zoom question, that'd be extremely grateful. Our next presenter is Dr. Rich McLaughlin, formerly of NCSU, recently retired. And he's going to give us an erosion and sediment control history, which should be interesting after the presentation we just had. Thank you, Rich.
Thank you. Always scary when you're introduced as having an interesting talk. It's a lot of pressure, you know. I gotta be interesting here. So So yeah, technically I'm retired, but I'm still associated with NC State. I'm an emeritus professor, which means I work but don't get paid. It's great position to be in because you don't have to show up. And one of the things that happened in my retirement is I stopped looking at my calendar every morning, which was a big mistake because right the day after Thanksgiving, I decided I'm going to do this treatment I have to do every year on my face to peel off damage from my younger years and running around in the sun without a hat or sunscreen. And I didn't look at my calendar to see that I was going to be standing in front of 100 people with a blotchy face, still healing from it. So excuse me for that. But let's talk about history. And I guess it makes sense for the retired guy to be talking about history. So I'm going to kind of take a little different perspective on this. We're going to talk about erosion history as affected by people. What have people been doing? And then we're going to kind of, as we get closer to our time in the world, talk about what government agencies have done and what kind of laws have been passed. And then eventually I'm going to get to what we have done at NC State over the past 20 years. So we'll be going through a kind of a wide variety of things. A lot of what I'm going to cite about historical erosion came from this great article from 2013. So I'm just going to cite it this one time. This is an academic thing. We have to attribute people's work whenever we cite it. So take a look at this graph. It's a little bit hard. Let me see if I can work the mouse. This is a really hard position to be in to look at your picture. Well, can you see the mouse now? Nobody can see a mouse except me. Okay. All right. Well, we got that established. So we're looking at the years 600 to 2000, what we call CE, used to be AD. So if you look at the graph, the key is you can see as civilization was expanding and developing in Europe, the woodlands were going down, the cropland was increasing, but also the erosion rate was increasing tremendously. Sure. These are pointing here. Okay. Great, thanks. So so on the left, there we go. This is a log scale. So you can see at some point we were losing a lot of land to erosion. There was actually a specific event in that year 1342 where there was such a big flood that all over Europe there were writings about this big flood and how the bridges were taken out. And so this was largely due to the fact that they were clearing a lot of land and nobody knew anything about conservation at that point. They were just clearing land, planting crops, and had tremendous amount of erosion. And this is an example of an erosive feature that's still evident. This is a gully that was formed around the 1600s in Poland. And you can see it's stabilized now, but this wasn't there before a bunch of farmers went in and started planting crops. So we were having a major impact on soil and erosion. And we'll talk about the effect of that later on. So there were some early observations, not a lot. It's very hard to find this information. I thought it was really interesting that of all the people, Da Vinci was one of the first ones to really observe the cause and effect of farming up in the hills and a lot of material washing down into the valleys, as you can see here. So this observation, they do not recognize the hills used to be covered in woodland, et cetera. So all that was holding things in place. Now it's not there. People are starting to figure out a cause and effect. Oh, we're farming. We have gullies now. We didn't used to have them. Maybe there's some relationship here. Still kind of surprising how long it took for us to think about maybe changing our behaviors. There was a textbook after a competition was put forth in Germany. And the question was, can somebody come up with a plan to try to reduce erosion? And you notice that we're all the way into 1815. So we've already had millennia of erosion happening and nobody's been doing anything about it. Mostly I'm talking about Europe. And so came up with a few recommendations such as keeping vegetation on the land. So does that sound familiar for those of you thinking about conservation? Soil loss means you're going to have poor crop responses when you put them in the ground. And then he had these great diagrams of terraces. Now, terraces was not invented by this person in 1815 in Europe. They've been in place all around the world, even in the Inca period and in China and Indochina. Terraces were well known. So this was sort of introducing to Europe this concept that had been around for a long time. Now, moving over to China, I'm not going to cover the whole world. This article did, and it was very interesting how things happen around the world. But China has a low plateau. This is wind deposited soil that's extremely erodible. We have several places like in Tennessee and out in Oregon and Washington in our country where we have beautiful loess that's really great for growing crops, but it's highly erodible if you don't protect the land. And what we're looking at here is a diagram of a gully that formed that is now by the 1300 was measured at 100 meters below where it was way back in 8000 BCE. So over this period of use, the population is increasing, they're cropping, they're eroding, and they've lost 100 meters. That's 300 feet of soil over that period of time. Pretty well documented. So people were having a pretty terrible effect on the landscape out there. And this is an example of features that are present now in China. We have them in the United States as well. The Grand Canyon of the East, which is in Georgia, that was all erosion that happened. So just a lot, the same old thing. We've got population increases. We've got the rivers getting filled up with sediment. We may have all heard of the Yellow River. Well, originally it was called the Great River because it was clear and beautiful and full of fish, et cetera. And with all this erosion in the uplands, we got the Yellow River, which has sometimes I've seen measurements 10 to 20% solids. Can you imagine? I mean, that's what's in the water. That's an amazing amount of sediment. All right, so now let's focus down on the United States a little bit. I'm sure this is a story that's familiar to many people. I teach it or taught it in the class that I used to teach. So we have the Europeans moving in. The Native Americans had done a lot of cropping. There was some evidence of erosion, but they didn't have the implements that we brought over from Europe to disturb large areas and do it frequently. So we had a lot of erosion, and I'm going to get to some things that you may see locally that are evident now from what was happening back then. So we had a lot of mills also, when you needed power to grind your grain or to saw your wood, we didn't have electricity, so water power was the main source. And Yates Mill out here, there's mills all over the Piedmont because that was the only source of energy that we had. Pretty much every stream that had any kind of a fall to it was dammed up and turned into some kind of a mill. So interesting side story is the mill owners often sued each other because they weren't releasing enough water to the downstream mill. And so there's all these great records in the British court system that was here during colonial days about where these were because people were suing each other all the time. So this is what the landscape ended up looking like with the type of farming that we were doing back then. Huge gullies. And people started again, think about this and think, well, maybe this is a problem. Maybe we need to be doing something about it. So moving along in history, the mills eventually were abandoned as we got electrical power and other sources of power. And the mills were generally not disassembled. They were just left there to degrade. The dams eventually, when a flood came along, would burst. And there's still evidence of these dams in a lot of our streams. You can find them, but they were just kind of left. 30s to 50s, we started to have tractors. That meant we could plow a lot more acres. We could get a lot more bare soil exposed. And so we started to see tremendous amounts of erosion on larger tracts of land. And then from the 1950s on, actually the amount of land that's being farmed has shrunk. It continues to shrink. Some of it's being developed, some of it's being abandoned, some of it's being set into conservation. So getting to what maybe some of you have seen, this is a picture of a Piedmont stream. And I grew up in the Piedmont. I used to play in streams that looked just like this. I just thought that was what streams look like. They had these steep banks and, they eroded all the time. Well, if you look a little closer, you can start to see some features in these banks. And it's really cool once you know what you're looking at. So at the very bottom, you'll see a layer, and this is actually what the stream bed looked like when the colonists came in from Europe. So that's where the natural stream bed was. And then we were talking about all that erosion that was happening. Well, where'd that soil go? That went into the valley. And so then you'll see a layer of soil that was kind of settling behind all those dams. So we have all these dams, basically sediment ponds. You got all this erosion happening, and then you dam the stream, so you're going to settle out the sediment. So there's a layer of that. And then on top of that, there are all the deposits from more recent, after the dams burst. And now we've just got erosion and flooding and settling in the valleys. So you actually can see these layers. It's kind of fun to see when you know what you're looking at. Now you can amaze all your friends when you go on a walk around a stream and say, hey, look at those layers. There's a history here. Let me tell you some history. And they'll roll their eyes and keep walking probably. All right. Now, there was a great paper done in 1945 where they went back and looked at sediment cores from a lot of areas around the Chesapeake Bay. And this happened to be the Baltimore Harbor. Now, what you can see on the left, you see that sort of upside down triangular shape. That's the actual stream right now, or the harbor right now. But if you look at the line that zigs down from that, that is where the natural bed was before colonists came from Europe and stripped all the land and planted mostly tobacco, and all the soil was washed down into the streams and now into the harbors. And so these, what's really interesting is there are harbors that we had back in the 1700s that were completely filled in. A good example, this is Joppatown, Maryland. It was recorded as a very busy port. And in fact, you can even go back now and you can see the big pilings where they would tie up the ships. But you're at least 2 miles from the nearest water. And that's how much sediment was coming down from all the farming operations that were going on up in the hills. Kind of amazing. I never knew that Joppatown, I grew up in Maryland. I knew where Joppatown was. I had no idea that and Bladensburg and some others were actually ports at one time. In fact, there's great stories about the Potomac River was filling up with sediment, and the Virginia side and the Maryland side kept putting in diversions to put the sediment over on the other side so that they could keep their ports open. And they had these fights over that. Well, what about North Carolina? Let's bring it home to North Carolina. So the reddish color there is the Piedmont. And one of the things you see up when you get up towards Chesapeake Bay and Maryland and up into Delaware, the Piedmont is almost right on top of the water. very close to the bay. So what was going on in the Piedmont was affecting the bay very quickly, very directly. However, you come down here, and we all know we have a big coastal plain. As you drive east, there's a few places you can actually kind of see the drop off. It's much more gentle here than it is up north. Like there's a place on US 301 where you just drop right down onto the coastal plain. It's a big drop, very interesting. But what does that mean? The Piedmont was where all the farming was happening. A lot of the erosion was happening, but where was the sediment going? Well, that was a question that someone tried to answer by looking at sediment in the Neuse River. And what they were looking for was mica, because that definitely was coming from geology up in the Piedmont. And so one of the things you can see here, as you get down past Kinston, that's mica right there, but there's no mica any further. So what they were inferring was that the sediment that was coming from these farming operations in the Piedmont never made it all the way to the coast, obviously, if it only got as far as, say, Kinston. So that's why we don't have the sediment that they had up north filling in our bays. There may be other sources of sediment, but it wasn't coming from the Piedmont. All right, so we've been blaming the people for doing all this damage to the environment. Well, Mother Nature can do a pretty good job as well. How many people have ever heard of these Missoula floods? So it's very interesting. So back about 14,000 years ago, the glaciers were kind of pulsing up and down before they finally retreated back to Canada. One of the glaciers would cut off a river. Cut off this river right there and form this lake up there in Montana. And the lake was a couple thousand feet deep. This was no little bit of water. It was the equivalent of Lake Erie and I think Lake Michigan put together. A lot of water. Well, every once in a while, as this water built up, it would lift up the ice and there would be a huge flow of water. It would just open the dam up. The dam would break. And can you imagine a 2,000-foot wall of water coming down a valley? What kind of damage that could do? It was amazing. And it happened not just once, but they estimate it could have happened up to 80 or 90 times that this dam would form, the lake would back up, dam would break, whoosh, big flood. And it went down essentially the Columbia River gorge. And there were places, you see the series of lakes that are sort of right in the middle there. That was because there was a notch that was a mile wide and 800 feet deep, and that was actually restricting the flow. Can you imagine that big of a notch was holding the water back so that it made this lake? So if you see these waterfalls, if you've ever visited the Columbia River area, you'll see these big waterfalls all coming down into the Columbia River. Why is that? Well, because this 2,000-foot wall of water scoured the valley and actually took out so much material that now there's waterfalls where there used to be a normal stream coming down into the river. So this was known as the biggest flood in all of world history. Kind of amazing, catastrophic flood. All right, so now let's get more modern. Let's talk about what did we start doing about this? Well, finally in the late 1800s, we got a government program with USDA to start looking at erosion. And the problem was that what they did initially was just assess erosion. They didn't actually try to fix it. They went around and looked at what was happening. They inventoried the gullies, et cetera. So it took a long time before they finally got around to trying to do something about it. And we should be very proud because Hugh Hammond Bennett founded the Soil Conservation Service. And he's from North Carolina, very charismatic apparently, and he sold the program. He was very good at selling the program. In fact, there's an anecdote that I think is true, that when he was trying to get money from Congress for the Soil Conservation Service, he was testifying in front of Congress, but he knew that there was a wall of dust coming from the Midwest from one of those big dust storms that happened in the 30s. And he got word from somebody. He had a number of people that were relaying word along the way, like, where is this? When's it going to hit? And as soon as it hit DC, then he took the Congress people over to the windows and he said, that's Nebraska you're looking at out there. And he got all his funding. So very good at getting that done. And I love this quote. He has a lot of great quotes, but as a soil scientist, we often say, no soil, no life. And that's essentially what he's pointing out here. This is a pretty important resource. Time to do something about it, not just observe it. And so here's an example of one of the things they did: stabilize a gully. Just cut it back, plant it, and make sure it doesn't do any more damage. And that kind of thing was common. Civilian Conservation Corps, if you've ever heard of them, they worked a lot with the Soil Conservation Service to get projects like this done. They also, of course, did a lot of education, a lot of work on tillage and trying to plant crops in the right place at the right time. So now let's fast forward a little bit more into more urban situation that we might be talking about here. And again, land development just has always increased. You can look at this history from 1982 on. We're getting a lot of development, a lot of farms being converted. All you have to do is look around our area and see an amazing amount of development. And of course, somebody put together this concept of these megalopolises, which I think is pretty evident now. This was put together many years ago. Basically, they were saying that the area from Raleigh to Birmingham, Alabama is basically merging into one big city, basically. And all you have to do is drive down 85 and you can kind of see this happening. Same thing in the Northeast and the Midwest. So we have these big development zones and we're part of one. And so what are we going to do about what's happening with development? Well, do we have a problem with development? Is that creating any issue with sediment? There was a great study done up in Durham where they took a look at the sources of sediment from either stream bank erosion or construction. And they went to 4 different creeks and used the geology of the sediment samples. And this is what they came up with. You can look at a pretty clear concentration, say in Lick Creek, where there was a lot of development happening and the majority of the sediment was coming from construction sites, as opposed to the New Light Creek, where there was no development and most of the sediment was coming from stream bank erosion. Because remember, the stream banks, even in rural areas, look like those pictures that I showed you. Even in a heavily wooded area, they're exposed and producing a lot of sediment. All right, so now let's get to regulations on construction and sediment from construction. So I believe Maryland was the first one to have a sediment control law. They actually set in 1961 said sediment was a pollutant and we needed to do something about it. Now you notice I said first design manual, ? If we look at our website, DEQ, for land quality, you'll see that it says there that we had the first manual in 1968. And this may answer a question that I've always had, because the Maryland, Virginia, and North Carolina manuals always seem to look alike. And, that's okay if you have a good manual. I always say the best compliment is somebody copies your manual. And so I don't know whether we copied theirs or they copied ours, but manuals were starting to come out in the early 70s. And of course, this 1973 law that was passed in North Carolina, probably in response to the Clean Water Act, one of the Clean Water Acts that Congress passed, set up the commission. You saw previously there was a whole lot of reference to the commission shall do this and the commission shall do that. And of course, we don't actually, I'm on the sediment commission, we don't actually do anything. We just let our DEQ people do everything. And we say, good job. Okay, so how about erosion control? Well, if we're going to have erosion control on construction sites, where are we going to get the information when we first developed these manuals? Well, we already knew that we wanted to have vegetation. And so, let's get vegetation out there. There are all kind of rules in the beginning. Now we're down to 7 and 14 days, which is much more reasonable than the 90 days or whatever we used to give people. And we're going to develop new products such as rolled erosion control blankets. That was a new thing. American Excelsior claims that they had the first one you see here in the 1960s, and many others have been developed. Hydromulch was developed. These were all in response to needs in the industry for getting grass established and stabilizing the soil and reducing erosion. So we had early sediment control practices. Some of you may be old enough to remember these. They were really not very effective. They were a great way to sell stone, but they only captured about half the sediment. And then we came up with this idea. I say we, Warren Faircloth came up with this idea of a skimmer to take the water off the top. But there was a lot of other things that a skimmer would do for you. And I think it's important to remember some of those things. And these were some early skimmer tests. So take a look at that skimmer there. It looks like it's PVC with some bricks on it. I don't know if that was really an early version of the skimmer that we see in the back here, but I do know that Mr. Faircloth went through a lot of iterations before he got to that design. So, and we were working with him up in Carborough and Chapel Hill, trying to get an idea of how well these were working. So you can see some instrumentation we were putting in. So let's talk about the skimmer basin functions. Why do we like skimmers so much? Well, one thing a skimmer does is it backs up the water initially and creates a pool. And as it turns out, the pool itself is a good sediment control device because the water comes in and the energy is dissipated. Also, at high flow, we're discharging over the dam. Hopefully we have a nice emergency spillway, and that is a surface outlet. So always remember that. And then once the flow ceases, we start to drain it down. And a lot of people will say there's good reasons for that, such as letting the sediment settle for a few days, et cetera. It also reduces the standing pool, depending on how you design your outlet. Mosquitoes, you see I have not so much. We do not see evidence that there's a lot of mosquito activity in sediment basins. Has anybody seen that? And I talked to a mosquito biologist on campus, and he said, well, they don't really like being around areas that are open and without any vegetation. And in addition, we sort of accidentally we were taking some measurements of water height, and the instrument we had in this basin also measured temperature. We didn't really care about it, but I looked at it, and the temperature would sometimes get up at that surface layer to over 105 degrees. And that's enough to pretty much kill anything that's trying to live there. And mosquitoes hang from the larvae anyway, hang from the surface. So it would not allow them to be there. So I've worked around hundreds of basins. I don't remember ever seeing mosquitoes as a problem. So, all right. And then we introduced porous baffles. We'll be demonstrating some of this afternoon. And anybody remember, I'm sure a lot of you have heard me talk about porous baffles, but anybody remember why we introduced porous baffles? All right. Well, I will tell you, but only out in the field. Sorry for you people online. Maybe we'll send you the answer. So we had the flow in the porous baffle, spread it and slow it down. Basically, we all know that. And we've come up as a group of industry and researchers with the ideal basin. How do we get the most sediment settled in a basin as opposed to those old rock dams that we used to have? And so we've got the surface outlet, we've got baffles, we've got stabilized sides, stabilized inlets, etc. Very simple. Okay. And then how about chemical treatments? Hey, now we're getting to my area. All right. What I've been doing for 20 years or so. And polyacrylamide was one of the things that we looked at quite a bit. And we stole the idea basically from agriculture, where they were putting it in furrows and eliminating essentially erosion in the furrow, which is a lot of fun. How about turbidity? How about that? Those fines that even a skimmer can't get settled out. And we've been working a lot on that, and we'll see some of that later on. We built the facility that we're going to, the Sediment Erosion Control Research and Education Facility, based on discussions with Dr. Al Jarrett at Penn State. This is him giving us a tour of his source pond, which he said is the most important part of a research facility, is to have a good source of gravity flow water. And so there I am at the start, and then at the end, we've got our facility that you'll see this afternoon. Done a lot of testing. When you don't have baffles, the water goes straight to the outlet. It doesn't interact much with the rest of the basin. Silt fence baffles can work, they're just not as good. And we'll talk about this afternoon. We've done a lot of work on construction sites, so we're very familiar with what happens on construction site and what can happen to your devices when you put them out on construction sites. And then just getting back to that polyacrylamide treatment for skimmer basins, you can see that we can get some pretty clear water if we get the treatment out. You need to have it done in the right place at the right time, in the right way, with the right chemical. But if you do, you can get some pretty amazing results. And we spent a lot of time over the last 20 years with getting our research information transferred to folks through workshops like this. And you'll see Karina will be talking about that, some research results later on. A lot of people involved. Very important, if you come out this afternoon, where you're going to park, you're going to get on Kai Road off of Lake Wheeler Road, and you're going to see our testing and research and all that on the left. You want to go right past that, you'll see all the trees, and look on the right, you'll see a nice parking lot. So be sure and drive past the site where you see people kind of getting ready for the workshop. All right, and any questions? All right, people are ready for a break.
Thank you, Rich. We're going to take approximately 10-minute break now, and we'll come back at 11 for our next presentation. If everyone can make their way back to their seats, our next presentation is about to begin. Our next presenter is Karina Lenko. She is from NCSU and is a graduate research assistant. Karina, if you'd like to go.
All right, so again, my name is Karina Lenko. I am a master's student at NC State, and I'm here today to talk to you a little bit about my research. My research is on diamond grinding slurry, and specifically today, I'm going to talk to you about the use of sediment basins for separation of diamond grinding slurries. And before we can talk about diamond grinding slurry, we have to talk about diamond grinding. So if you're not familiar with diamond grinding, it's a road resurfacing technique, and you take diamond saw blades, stack them together into a cylinder. That cylinder goes into a machine, and that machine will grind off the top 1/8 of an inch to 1/4 inch of the road's surface. And the reason why we concrete grind roads is it improves the rideability, it'll reduce road noise, and it improves the friction between tires and the road's surface. So here are some photos of concrete surfaces as poured and then after diamond grinding. So you can see that corduroy texture, that's been diamond ground. And when you diamond grind a road, there's a lot of friction on diamond saw blades. As you can imagine, you're cutting concrete. So what they do to combat the heat from that friction is water gets poured over those blades. So you're pouring water over the blades, you're cutting down the concrete, and what comes out the other side is diamond grinding slurry. It looks a little something like this. It's gray, it's opaque. Its pH is between 9 and 12.5. That pH changes just depending on the concrete mix. And to give you an idea of the scale, you'll generate about 4.33 gallons of slurry per square yard of concrete you resurface. So if you were to grind a 1-lane, 1-mile section of road, you would generate roughly 30,000 gallons of diamond grinding slurry. And that would be equivalent to 725 barrels of oil. And it would require about 3 heavy-duty tanker trucks, assuming those tanker trucks can hold 9,000 gallons of slurry each. So that's diamond grinding. Now we can get into my research and diamond grinding slurry management practices. The most common practice for diamond grinding slurry management is roadside application. You can see in this photo, there's some gray stuff in the shoulder of that road. That's diamond grinding slurry. So as you're generating the slurry, you just deposit it on the side of the road. And I know you're thinking, well, that sounds great. We should just do that. Your talk's over. It's not really feasible in North Carolina. We have narrow shoulders. You need a certain amount of area to be applying a certain rate of diamond grinding slurry. So our shoulders are too narrow. We also have too much precipitation. If you think about everything we already do to limit sediment getting into waterways, you don't want to be applying diamond grinding slurry to the side of the road, just have it wash into a stream. So what we do here instead, the most common thing is the press plate system. And this photo is the same photo as earlier. It is not a photo of a press plate system. That is proprietary. So this is just the diamond grinding operation. When the diamond grinding slurry is generated, it's vacuumed up from behind the blades. It goes into a tanker truck. That tanker truck then travels to the press plate. The press plate could be 30 minutes away. It could be an hour away. It's going to be at a different site. And with road grinding, obviously you're moving up and down a road. So you could get closer to the press plate, you could get further from it. Regardless, you're going to have some costs incurred during transport. Excuse me. So once the DGS gets to the press plate system, it's offloaded. The press plate will, as it sounds, it'll press the solids out of the liquid. The water can then be reused in grinding. So it just gets put back into the same tanker truck and trucked back to the site for reuse. And then those solids will be used as backfill, or they can be sent to a landfill for disposal. And this is what we do right now. It can be costly. It's not on site. It's a bit of an ordeal to separate the diamond grinding slurry. And there's been a desire to make some changes to how we manage diamond grinding slurry in North Carolina. And one of the ideas that has come out of this is, what if we used a sediment basin? So we already use sediment basins to separate solids out of water. So why couldn't we just pivot that design and separate diamond grinding slurry? Obviously, you saw diamond grinding slurry, it's very opaque. There's a lot more solids in the diamond grinding slurry than there's going to be sediment in water on your construction site, but it's the same basic idea. And this basin that you can see in the photo, I believe, is the second basin to be used in the state for separation of diamond grinding slurry. It was done outside of Statesville at the interchange of I-77 and I-40, and it is in the right-of-way off the highway. So it's very close. The tanker trucks drive maybe 1 minute, 2 minutes, depending on where they are in the grinding operation, and they offload their slurry. And this video shows you what it looks like when the trucks offload slurry. So the basin had been in use for about a month at this point. So there's a pretty solid basis there of sediment, and the slurry is dumped in, it flows over the top, and then it approaches the baffles. When it gets to the baffles, you can see there's that turbid water on the right side. And then as it hits the baffle, it's getting impounded. You get laminar flow out the other side. And again, sediment basins are used in sediment and erosion control commonly. And another practice we thought might be useful from sediment and erosion control is the use of polyacrylamide and flocculants. So if you were on a site and you were diamond grinding a road and you found that your slurry wasn't separating well in the basin, could you then use polyacrylamide to encourage settling in your DGS? And you absolutely can. So this is an image of control DGS in a Imhoff cone. So this is just DGS as it settles naturally. You can get a bit of settling just as it sits there on the counter. There's a thin layer of clear water at the top, and then it is back to its normal opaque condition. Then here are 3 images. So there's 3 different PAMs being used here. Similar to when you use PAM in soils, you have to match the DGS to the polyacrylamide. Different concrete mixes will have different chemical properties. And because of those changes in chemical properties, you'll have to match them to the PAM. But it's very possible we saw good settling, good flocculation, depending on the PAM used. So here's another video. This is as the water is approaching the second baffle. You can see there's a pretty solid pool of water at the end, and there's a skimmer there. That skimmer is going to suck up the water and pump it uphill. When it gets uphill, it makes it to the 2 evaporation basins, which are in the photo on the right. It goes into the first evaporation basin. Once that basin fills with water, there's a spillway, so that water can then go into the second basin. Once it's in the second basin, that water will either be used to wash out the trucks. So as you transport diamond grinding slurry, it's going to settle to some degree. And when you're offloading it, you need to wash out the truck to get those last bits of concrete out and just kind of agitate the slurry some more. And then additionally, it'll get reused in the grinding operation, similar to how at the press plate, the water is reused. So this is the basin in its use while the grinding operation is happening, but at some point they're done grinding the road. So what happens when you close the basin? At the end of the basin's life, you end up with 2 waste products. The first waste product is the wastewater. It can sit in those evaporation basins and evaporate off, or it can be sent to a water treatment plant and just taken away there. We are looking into possible research to use that water on site, but that's some future research and not the focus of my project. Other thing you end up with as a waste product is concrete solids. So at this point in the basin's life, there's no new diamond grinding slurry being added to it. They're just trying to dewater the slurry they have. And that's why the solids are piled up like that. It's to encourage the water to flow out of the solids and out to the end of the basin. In order to close this basin, the solids have to pass a paint filter test. So if you took the concrete solids and put them in a 60 mesh paint filter, depending on how much water comes out of that paint filter, they're either considered solids or they're not considered solids. Once they're considered solids, they could close that basin. And when we were looking at this, you know, you have a waste product, but it's also just something that's sitting there. You're waiting for the basin to dewater. Is there a possibility of using these solids for something else? And again, diamond grinding slurry has a high pH, and a lot of that high pH is from the concrete solids. So we were brainstorming and we were thinking of what you need something of a high pH for at a construction site. So you have a lot of exposed subsoil that you're going to have to revegetate. And when you're revegetating that subsoil, you're going to use lime. If we have a waste product, we're just going to fill in that basin. We're not going to do anything with these solids. Why couldn't we use those high pH solids as a liming product? So we set up an experiment with 2 different studies to see if we could use the concrete solids from diamond grinding slurry as liming products. And this would not only be for the sediment basin solids, but also the solids that you get out of the press plate. So it would work for both management practices. The soils we used were a clay loam from Breeze Farms out in Durham, and then a sandy loam from Lake Wheeler. We used 5 treatments of diamond grinding slurry. So it went up to 26 kilograms per meter squared. And that was on a dry weight basis. So we took whole diamond grinding slurry and evaporated the water off in the oven and just used the dry concrete powder essentially. We started with a soil incubation study. We wanted to measure the pH and the electrical conductivity. Measurements were taking at 2, 4, 8, and 16 weeks. And then once we'd established how pH and electrical conductivity were changing with the different additions of diamond grinding slurry, we looked at how seeds were germinating in those rates. So we used centipede, Bermuda, and Kentucky bluegrasses, and then rye grain, roughly 30 seeds of each. And these are all NCDOT approved vegetation. So starting with the soil incubation study results, the sandy loam soil started at a pH just below 5. You'll see that first addition of diamond grinding slurry, there's a big jump in pH. That is expected. Sandy loam has a lower buffering capacity, so it's not able to combat that addition of high pH material as well. But as you increase your rate, we double the rate, we more than double the rate, you're not seeing a proportional increase in pH despite those doubling and more than doubling of the rate. Similar, but a little bit different in the clay loam soil. Clay loam has a higher buffering capacity. So instead of the 0 to 2.24 having a really big jump in pH, that jump in pH happens over 2 steps. And then you see a similar trend where that pH seems to level out at a certain point. Once we established pH, we also could look at EC. So the electrical conductivity was likely to be affected by the additions of diamond grinding slurry. Concrete has calcium in it. Calcium is a soluble salt. When you increase this amount of soluble salts in your soil, you're going to increase your electrical conductivity, and that can have an effect on the soil's physical properties and also on the success of germination in the soil. So it was important to quantify that. For our sandy loam soil, you can see here that I mentioned earlier with pH, we weren't seeing a proportional increase in pH with the increase in rate. For EC, there's a bit more of that proportional trend. So from 8.96 to 26 kilograms per meter squared, there's that big jump because that rate's more than doubling there. And it almost looks like an exponential trend in these graphs. Then for our clay loam soil, it's a bit more linear, but still you can see there's that big jump at the last 2 rates. So from this, we can see that if you're going to be using the concrete solids as a liming product, your EC is going to be a determining factor more than your pH in the rate you can apply or the amount you can use as lime. And once we established pH and EC and how those are going to be affected by the rates of diamond grinding slurry solids applied, we had to establish how seeds were going to germinate, because if we are using this as a liming product and we want to grow vegetation, we're going to need to actually be able to grow that vegetation. So our germination study, these are the results on the y-axis, that's your germination rate in percent. Rye grain had no issues. Rye grain wants to grow no matter where you put it or how much diamond grinding slurry solids you're putting with it. There was no significant difference between the rates of diamond grinding slurry and no significant difference between the soils. Kentucky bluegrass was a little less successful in its germination, but that wasn't a result of the rates. It was just not germinating as well. And similarly, Bermuda grass didn't germinate as well, but that's not because of the diamond grinding slurry. It just wasn't as successful. The one seed that did see a significant difference was centipede grass. At that 8.96 kilograms per meter squared and 26 kilograms per meter squared, there was diminished germination rate. So it did better with the lower rates of slurry than it did with the higher rates. And it's important to note that this germination study was only done one time, so we still have to replicate it, and we'll see if these trends hold. But for now, this is what we've seen. And so I've talked about a lot today. We started off talking about diamond grinding, what it is, why we do it. Then we got into roadside application of diamond grinding slurry. Seems great. We can't really do it here. And then we talked a bit about the press plate. That's our current system. It works, but it can be quite expensive. And so then we got into the sediment basins, how we're trying to pivot sediment basins from just a sediment and erosion control measure into new applications. And then we talked a little bit about some value-added approaches for those solids that we get from both the press plate system and the sediment basin. So some key takeaways. Sediment basins are an effective option for on-site DGS separation. We have more research to do to quantify how effective the sediment basin is, but just from the two projects using a sediment basin, it seems to be working. They are going to continue to make changes as they see fit, and we're hoping to be able to make some suggestions using my research as well. Polyacrylamide is effective in DGS, similar to soil. You just have to match the soil to the polyacrylamide. Same thing with DGS, you just have to match it. DGS solids have the potential to be used for on-site liming. The additions of those DGS solids will increase the soil pH and EC. Those increases were anticipated. It did not make the soil saline. It did increase the EC, it increased the pH, but everything we saw, we were anticipating, and now we can make better recommendations for the use of diamond grinding slurry solids as liming agents. And then the germination of rye grain, Bermuda grass, Kentucky bluegrass was not impeded by DGS additions to the soil. However, centipede grass germination was diminished when higher rates of DGS were added to the soil. And then I just have to acknowledge the NCDOT, they fund my research, and then some of my colleagues at NC State and Lane Construction. So if anyone has any questions, I would be happy to answer them. So the question was about the grasses and whether or not we had 100% germination on our controls. We did not. So the bars the furthest to the left, that's no diamond grinding slurry application. So it's just them germinating in the soil. And they did not have 100% germination. So that's part of the reason why we need to replicate the study. But we were not seeing a significant difference between not adding diamond grinding slurry and adding it for Kentucky bluegrass and Bermuda grass, but centipede grass did have the difference. I would account for the low germination, just they were in petri dishes. They were grown using just sunlight from the windows. So we could have. We definitely need to replicate the study is the main thing, but we just weren't seeing that good of germination. And again, that's part of the reason why we do need to replicate it. Mhm. Pardon me? So that basin was done by Lane Construction. We were not involved in the design of the basin. That was an existing design, and they had done all of that. We were essentially just allowed to observe it. No one. Mhm. Mm. Yeah, so the pH is increased quite a bit. There would, you likely have to match based on what target your pH you're looking for. And then with the soil incubation, these were not leached. So this is the effect of just mixing dry soil, dry diamond grinding slurry together, setting it at a certain water content and leaving them. You would likely see more change if they were leached. So that's a future research option as well. All right, if no one has any more questions, I will go back to the slide with the QR code. Thank you.
Thank you, Karina. And let me pull up our next presentation. Our next presentation is a joint presentation by two of our regional engineers. So we have Tamara Eplin and Stan Aiken from NCDEQ presenting on trout buffer waivers in North Carolina.
Good morning. Trout waters in North Carolina are quite important. There are many in this very room that absolutely enjoy fishing. North Carolina is very famous for its natural resources, and a favorite natural resources are the trout waters in the western half of the state. Stan Aiken is the regional engineer for the Asheville region, which covers the western part of the state. I have 15 counties in the upper middle, Piedmont, and Mooresville region has a couple counties that also have trout waters. So we're very happy to talk about this with you today. We're going to talk about what trout waters are, why protecting them is necessary, when are the trout buffer waivers and variances necessary? And we're just going to refer to waivers today. Stan's going to talk a little bit about the trout moratoriums that may apply to your project and the trout waiver application process and design recommendations. There's a bulk of information that's being provided today. This presentation will be available by PDF afterward, and Stan's design recommendations have been passed out. Those will also be available afterward. If you have any questions, you can always call us. So first, trout waters. Trout waters are suitable for the breeding of trout and maintenance of stocked trout. That's pretty clean. And those waters do not have to have trout in them to be classified as trout waters. It just means that the environment is there in the waters for the existence of trout. All named and unnamed tributaries draining to trout waters are also classified as trout waters. So now, why is protecting trout waters necessary? This seems intuitive to a lot of us, but to put it in technical terms, all impact to trout waters is permanent impact. If you mess with their living environment, they will not recover. They are extremely sensitive to temperature and turbidity. The surface water standard for trout waters is not less than 6 milligrams per liter dissolved oxygen and 10 NTUs. And by reference, trout waters, that NTU standard is 50 NTUs. So they require a much cleaner environment. They are rather finicky about the environment that they live in. It must be clean. This is an example of trout water impacts above the construction site is shown in that left picture. And after a significant violation at the site that impacted the trout waters is shown on the right side. And that unfortunately this does occur. So how do you tell if you have trout waters? You're getting ready to design your project. I encourage everyone, whether it is a project on the eastern side of the state or the western side of the state, go to this website and figure out what waters you're working in. Also figure out the post-construction stormwater requirements for your site, but that's a different presentation. Figure out what the surface water classification is. And if you see the little TR, you can search by address, the stream, whatever, figure out where that stream is, click on it, a box comes up with a lot of information. If you see TR, that means you have a trout classified stream. If you see a plus symbol, hit the brakes and call the regional engineer because you have high quality waters and additional requirements. That's an additional presentation, but call us and talk about your project, because there are additional limitations. The trout buffer zone requirements, I have gone through, I just copied the regulations so that you have it for reference. Keep in mind, again, you'll get the PDF of this afterward. But the trout buffer zone is the 25 feet from the top of the bank inland. And that zone must be protected per our set of Environmental Management Commission. Disturbance to the buffer must be temporary and minimal. And interpretation of that is up for debate, but that is the entire crux of this regulation. Any impact to trout buffers must be temporary and minimal. And it must be limited to a maximum of 10% of the reach. If you have a 100-acre lot, then we're talking 10 feet. If you have a 2,000-acre stream going through the middle of a golf course, this is a situation I'm dealing with in my region, then the impact can be 100 feet, but not 100 feet within 1,000 feet maximum, unless you receive a trout waiver. And when we're looking at these applications, they are very specific to your construction project. We're looking for temporary and minimal. Stan will get into these design considerations a little later. But the trout waiver is required for you to work in that area. We also need to point out that as part of our reviews, we're trying to prevent water quality violations because we cannot approve a plan that may contribute to water quality violations. And that's what that last bullet item references. This is something we do not like to see in trout waters. This is a stream restoration project, and the developer believed that they were exempt from our trout buffer requirements, and that's a long story. But as you can see, the entire trout buffer is being worked in. Disturbance is not temporary and minimal. We prefer strongly that if you're going to work in the stream, that you have dry conditions, you're doing a pump around, there are a lot of factors involved, but to see something like this in a trout stream violates a number of regulations. This is also something we often see. Someone spends their entire life savings buying that lot on the lake that happens to be classified as trout. And they decide that they want to see the entire portion of the lake that's available to them, and they clear the entire back of their lot to do that. This is a clear violation of our trout buffer regulations, and we address this rather often. A common question that comes up is, but what if I'm disturbing less than an acre? I'm not subject to the SPCA or the Sediment Pollution Control Act. Everyone who conducts land disturbing activity in North Carolina is subject to the Sediment Pollution Control Act unless they are categorically exempt. So activity that's less than an acre is also subject to the trout buffer regulations. Trout buffer plans are not limited to that 1 acre threshold. And if you have questions about any activity within those buffers, we are happy to take your calls. We stay very busy, but we are happy to take your calls and answer whatever questions you have, especially as they relate to these trout buffers. Another thing I just want to go ahead and point out is that, because I'm here, is that the responsibility for implementing these trout buffer requirements is not delegated to the local programs. I can't even delegate that to my assistant engineers. So do feel free to call Stan, me, or Zaicon in the Mooresville office. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to Stan Aiken to briefly discuss trout moratoriums and then design considerations. Thank you.
Thank you, Tamara. As Tamara just stated, I'm Stan Aiken. I'm the Asheville Regional Engineer. Cover the western 19 counties. And I'm happy to discuss this with you, even though we've got the M word here, the moratorium word. That's not something that we enforce, but rather that is something that North Carolina Fish and Wildlife enforce. And right here is the contact, Andrea Leslie. This is in your handout. And as Tamara said, this will be provided to you. So you don't have to frantically write. You're going to have a couple of copies of it. But Andrea Leslie is the one to contact to find out when or if a moratorium applies. There are a couple of different ones depending upon the type of trout that stream would support. So that's just a piece of information that you really need and need to have had here. Full disclosure, I'm not a fisherman at all. I'm entirely too loud and way too impatient to even attempt to fish. However, a lot of people do fish for relaxation, and imagine that you've just had a horrendous week of design work and you're going to take a 3-day vacation and you're wanting to go up to the mountains and see if you can't drown a hook or try to capture a fish. Which stream here, the one on the left or the one on the right, is what you're hoping that you're going to see? I think we'd all agree that we want the one on the left. you wouldn't think that, you know, the one on the right would be something that's going to be very beneficial to you. You know, right here, well, do you think they're busting the 10 NTU limit? 10 NTUs, that sounds really, you know, strange. Most people don't think in terms of NTU. And if you're not familiar with it, a cloudy glass of water that comes out of a tap from a well can exceed 10 NTUs. It's 10 NTUs is very, very little. So I think they've exceeded the units here. And they probably got a few other pollutants. And, you know, the good news is they probably washed all the, you know, hydraulic fluid off of their piece of equipment. The bad news is it went straight to the trout stream. So, you know, there's a few issues here. So it's really important that we get together a plan. And the reality of it is the plan's not for the regulators. I mean, everyone tends to try to put the plans together for the regulators, but the plan is for the contractor. The plan is to guide the contractor so that the contractor does not make these kind of mistakes. So that the contractor does not harm their neighbor or harm their client. So so with that, we'll kind of get into the trout buffer waiver application process. As Tamara said, you know, you want to contact the regional engineer for whichever region it is, and it would be one of the 3 western regions. And once again, responsibility for trout buffer waiver approvals, that does not go to local programs. That comes to us. As she said, we can't even delegate it to our review engineers. And you want to submit all the required materials for a trout buffer waiver and the associated ENSC plan. You want to do it prior to submitting it with the ENSC plan, because that trout buffer waiver is kind of a portion of that erosion sedimentation control plan. And you want to make sure that you've kind of got all the parts together. So you want to do it prior to submitting the erosion sedimentation control permit. There is no statutory deadline for review of the trout buffer waiver. So as such, sometimes it can exceed the 30 days that you'll see, you know, otherwise, or 15 days for revision. And that's another reason you kind of want to get it in there ahead of time. You want to be talking about it. You want to make sure that you've got a really good, thorough plan. Up here, I went ahead and put in the supplemental buffer waiver information sheet. Couple of things to point out on this. You'll note that it actually says the length of the buffer impairment. One of the things that you want to look at, that's the distance linearly along the stream that you're going to be within 25 feet of that top of bank. You might only be 1 foot into the 25 feet, but if you're doing it for more than 10% of the length of stream on your property, or more than 100 feet, whichever is shorter, then you're going to need a trout buffer waiver. So just a little bit of information there. You will need to fill out one of these sheets to submit with your plan. And we'll get into that just a little bit later. Design recommendations. For this, I'm going to give your necks a break where you don't have to look up the screen. You've got a handout. We're going to basically kind of go into the handout and talk about it a little bit. Okay. In the handout, it's broken out into various sections. It's broken out into reference, which the reference section has the laws that Tamara pointed out before. And I actually copied and pasted them. You'll see that some areas are shaded. They're actually on the original, they were highlighted. That's kind of sections that are specifically talking about trout buffers, with the exception of the 15A NCAC 04.0125, which that entire section is specifically with regard to trout waters. So these are the rules that we are working from. Then we go into applicability, design considerations, and materials to be submitted. So applicability, I've got 4 questions here. And you need to answer, if you answer yes to all 4 of these questions, then you're definitely going to need a trout buffer waiver. You know, is the water body that you're working next to, is it classified as trout? Now, don't take into account, take into account that the map that she showed you earlier, it's got blue line streams on it, but there may be a water body that's that wide that goes down and it flows into a stream that is shown on that map. But that water body is not shown on that map. However, if it is classified as a stream, then it takes on the classification of the stream it flows into. So you type in your address, you don't see a blue line, you're not automatically off the hook for a trout buffer waiver. You're going to need to look and see where that goes, what it flows into. And you want to make sure on that. As far as the next question, am I disturbing more than 10% of the length of stream in my property or more than 100 feet? As Tamara said, you might have a parcel that has 2,000 feet of stream. And the way the law reads is within any 1,000 feet, only 100 feet of buffer disturbance is allowed. So if you've got 2,000 feet, but you want to put 100 feet here and then another 100 feet right here, you can't do it because within that 1,000 feet, you've got 200 feet of disturbance. So you need to take that into consideration. Is the project being constructed, is it something other than something that absolutely has to be over, under, or in the water, such as a dock, a bridge, that type of thing? There are certain exemptions for that. So if it is anything other than that, then it's something that would probably require a waiver. Is the disturbance greater than 10% as described above, encroaching to within the 25 feet from top of bank of the stream? So that's where I'm saying, if you're 1 foot into the 25 feet, but you are 1 foot in for greater than the 10%, then you're going to need to get a waiver. So we've got, we'll go into the design considerations. And with the design considerations, you want to make sure you've got very robust erosion sedimentation control measures. That trout waters, they are very sensitive waters. We all try to keep, sediment off adjoining property. We all try to keep sediment out of streams. Here's where you kind of just go into overdrive a little bit. You want to put your more robust measures in, put your best foot forward. You want to make sure that you don't want to exceed that 10 NTUs. You also don't want to stage or stockpile any materials or equipment in the buffer. Well, why can't I leave my equipment overnight within the 25 feet? Well, your equipment might leak. It might leak hydraulic fluid. It might leak oil. Filling it up. You might be pouring fuel into your piece of equipment and it could spill over. And then if you've got the buffer cleared, there's nothing to treat it. So no fueling of equipment within the trout buffer. You want to phase the work so that you only disturb what you can put back or stabilize at the end of the day or by the end of the day. Are there larger projects that, where that's not reasonable? Absolutely. But at that point, you need to be coordinating with us. You need to be talking to us, and we'll, talk with you and see how we can phase it and what things that we could do to help mitigate on that. Any stream or stream bank work performed in the dry. Once again, you get into, if you're working on that stream bank, you want to make sure that that work is being done in the dry, that you've got some sort of sandbag cofferdam or something of that nature, that you're pumping out and you're pumping out into like a silt bag or a basin, and that you are not adding turbidity to the water that is in the stream. And if you're actually, having to, if you're actually having to dam up and do a bypass, you need to show that in your trout buffer waiver plan. This is going to sound strange, but within the trout buffer, do not use polyacrylamides or fertilizer. Use only fully biodegradable matting, such as core fiber matting, and with wood stakes in lieu of regular matting. So basically, we don't want to give any opportunity for unnatural chemicals to get into the stream. Trout are finicky. They're like some of my kids have been. They're very picky eaters. So you want to make sure that you protect the stream to the greatest extent possible. You also don't want to direct concentrated flow directly into the stream. Buffers are generally meant to treat sheet flow, flow that's spread out. And obviously, when you're taking away the buffer and you're throwing concentrated flow in there, you're getting anything and everything. So you don't want to direct concentrated flow into the stream. You want to turn it into sheet flow. And preferably, if you've got water coming down toward the buffer that you've disturbed, you want to make sure that you want to take it and send it somewhere where you've actually got buffer and turn it into sheet flow so that it can be treated, or you're going to have to mechanically somehow treat it. So you also need to be aware that water which comes off of any type of concrete, asphalt, roofs, stone patios, those are thermal masses. They soak up the sun, they heat up, water hits it, it heats up, and then it's going into this other water, which you cannot change the temperature of. And I say don't change the temperature of any zone of it more than half of a degree, because that is an impact. So how do you resolve that? Well, tilt those things to drain away from the buffer. Take that flow and take it where it will go through a buffer that is intact. Or you could potentially take it underground and do underground detention to allow it to cool off. You just need to be aware of it. Minimize your thermal masses. The next one, I grew up with a porch about that far off the ground. And underneath, the one thing I noted every time I went under it to get something is there is literally nothing that grows under there. It's bare dirt. Anytime you've got elevated porches, and I don't care if it's 4 feet off the ground or if it's 10 feet off the ground, you're not going to get a lot to grow under them. So you need to show how you're going to stabilize that area. That's one of the things that you kind of need to be aware of, is how you're going to stabilize any area under porches from drip erosion that's going to come through the slats of the porch, and it's going to get there, and you just don't want sediment moving in any way, shape, or form. It doesn't have to be excessive, but we need to see how you're going to handle that. It needs to be addressed. You want to make sure that all the plantings that you put in are riparian buffer plantings that are included in this guidelines. And once again, this is in your handout. And also, here's where we have the contact for the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Coordinator. Now, probably the portion that you really want to know. The materials to be submitted for the trout buffer waiver plan. You want that completed supplemental information sheet that I showed you earlier. Unfortunately, I don't think we have that on our website, but we can certainly get you a copy if you contact us. I don't think we've asked yet for it to be included in the website, in part just because it only really deals with 3 regions. We need a very detailed narrative to tell us what you're doing, why you need to be in that buffer, why you can't be outside the buffer. Tell us how you propose to do it, how you're proposing to protect that stream, and give us a very detailed narrative telling us what you're doing, why you're doing it, and how you're doing it. And give us a very robust erosion sedimentation control plan. And like I said, it needs to be a little bit extra. It needs to be an erosion control plan with attitude. And so basically, that's another portion of it. Give us a detailed construction sequence, because once again, that plan is not for us, it's for your contractor. You're going to need to tell him exactly what you're thinking, and that's not always easily done, but the best way to communicate that is through very detailed plans, very detailed construction sequence, and frequent meetings, honestly. You want a very, you want a thorough landscape plan, which includes plants, once again, with approved in the guidelines for riparian buffer restoration as noted above. And that basically, that's, as my kids would put it, that's the cheat code for stream buffer applications. And I think I just went through all this and didn't even switch the slide, but basically, once again, refer to the handout. The handout's got all this information in it. This has my contact as well as Tamara's and Zahid's. And I will say this, in the presentation, Tamara did a phenomenal job. She put up nice pictures of pretty trout buffer waivers, and I put up the ones that were just an absolute nightmare. And I think of it this way: I'll show you the nightmare, you show me the pretty ones. Thank you. I appreciate your time. Oh, yeah, sure. Do you have any questions? Yes, sir. The question was, does the surface water classification map identify the tributaries to trout waters, or do you have to track it down? If it is shown on the map, it will identify it. But if it's just if it's a small brook that is flowing into a creek that may not be shown on the map, then you're going to need to actually identify where that flows. And that, you can generally do that through Google Earth or a pretty good topo map. Any other questions? Yes, sir. Okay, he said that there is a map from his experience that does have most of the tributaries on it, and you can generally find it there. Any other questions? Yes, Julie. You might have stumped me here. Actually, you were referring to the 10% rule. Does it apply to one side of the stream or both sides of the stream? My answer to that, generally, what I'm looking at is if you own each side of the stream, I would do it independently. I would do one side independently from the other. So if you're on 1,000 feet of stream and it's cutting directly through the middle of your property, and you've got 1,000 feet of stream on both sides, and you only want to disturb on one side, but you want to disturb 200 feet, no. It only applies to each 1,000 feet. Let's say you've got 500 feet and you own 500 feet on both sides of the stream, but you want to disturb 100 feet on one side of the stream, then I would go ahead and get a trout buffer waiver. And really all that does is, yes, it's one more step in the process, but ultimately and finally, it protects you, it protects the contractor, and it protects the owner. And more than that, it protects those incredibly picky eaters that are in the stream.
And we haven't discussed large projects that simply drain to trout waters today. But if we have subdivisions or other large projects that are draining to trout waters, those projects will receive a beefed up review because any impact to those trout buffers is permanent impact. So we're looking to see that we have dispersed flow going into those buffers. We're looking to make sure that the design standards are very thoroughly met. We are looking at your construction sequence. Many of the design standards that apply to the trout buffers may apply to a larger project above it because we cannot approve a project that is likely to violate a water quality standard.
Yeah, and in that realm, just some things to consider are you don't want to put the edge of your slope right at 25 feet from the stream. You want to bring it back in a little bit so that you've got room to maintain your measures, to inspect your measures. And quite frankly, if you're right on the edge of a trout stream, you want to make sure that your inspections are a little bit more frequent, that your measures are a little bit more beefed up. And once again, you've got to look at that concentrated flow because you don't want concentrated flow going through the buffer. I believe you had a question, sir. Yes, he said that I'd mentioned no polyacrylamide inside the buffer, but it's permissible to use it outside the buffer. Yes, but I would use it very sparingly. Any other thoughts, questions? All right. Well, with that, I don't want to be the thing that stands between you and food because I know what that's like. Have a wonderful day. Thank you.
Before you all start shifting too much, let me just get through a couple last minute announcements. First of all, thank you for joining us for our third hybrid annual North Carolina Erosion and Sediment Control Workshop. And special thanks to our presenters and our workshop organizing partners. Everyone, please remember to complete the online evaluation. In-person attendees, remember to sign for your PDH certificates, PDH hours at the registration desk before you leave for the field. Your certificates will be handed out in the field for in-person attendees, and lunch is in the room immediately next door. Remember to head to the field by about 12:45 because we will start around 1. The address for the field was on the slides earlier, but it is 4000 CHI Road. So 4000 Chi Road. For online attendees, this concludes the virtual workshop. You will receive your certificate via email within 2 weeks, and we've dropped the evaluation link into the chat a few times now. Thanks everyone for attending, and I will let you all go.